Section 27 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Agatha Webb by Anna Katharine Green. Section 27, The Adventure of the Parcel. A man! Haul him in! Don't leave a poor fellow drifting about like that. The speaker, a bluff, hearty skipper whose sturdy craft had outridden one of the worst storms of the season, pointed to our poor friend Sweetwater, whose head could just be seen above the broken spar he clung to. In another moment a half-dozen hands were stretched for him, and the insensible form was drawn in and laid on a deck which still showed the results of the night's fierce conflict. "How ugly he is!" cried one of the sailors, with a leer at the half-drowned man's face. "I'd like to see the lass we'd please in saving him. He's only fit to poison a devil-fish." But though more than one laugh rang out, they gave him good care, and when Sweetwater came to life and realized that his blood was pulsing warmly again through his veins, and that a gray sky had taken the place of darkness, and a soundboard supported limbs which for hours had yielded helplessly to the rocking billows, he saw a ring of hard but good-natured faces about him, and realized quite well what had been done for him when one of them said, "There, he'll do now. All hands on deck. We can get into New Bedford in 2 days if this wind holds. Nor-west," shouted the skipper to the man at the tiller. "We'll sup with our old women in 48 hours." New Bedford! It was the only word Sweetwater heard. So he was no farther away from Sutherlandtown than that. Evidently Providence had not meant him to escape, or was it his fortitude that was being tried? A man as humble as he might easily be lost, even in a place as small as New Bedford. It was his identity he must suppress. With that unrecognized, he might remain in the next village to Sutherlandtown without fear of being called up as a witness against Fredrick. But could he suppress it? He thought he could. At all events, he meant to try. "What's your name?" were the words he now heard shouted in his ear. "Jonathan Briggs," was his mumbled reply. "I was blown off a ship's deck in the gale last night." "What ship?" "The Proserpine." It was the first name that suggested itself to him. "Oh, I thought it might have been the Hesper. She foundered off here last night." Foundered? The Hesper? The hot blood was shooting now through his veins. "Yes, we just picked up her name-board. That was before we got a hold on you." Foundered! The ship from which he had been so mercilessly thrown, and all on board lost perhaps. He began to realize the hand of Providence in his fate. "It was the Hesper I sailed on. I'm just not clear yet in my head. My first voyage was made on the Proserpine. Well, bless the gale that blew me from that deck." He seemed incoherent, and they left him again for a little while. When they came back he had his story all ready, which imposed upon them just so far as it was for their interest. Their business on this coast was not precisely legitimate, and when they found he simply wanted to be set on shore, they were quite willing to do thus much for him. Only they regretted that he had barely $2 and his own soaked clothing to give in exchange for the motley garments they trumped up amongst them for his present comfort. But he, as well as they, made the best of a bad bargain. He especially, as his clothes, which would soon be scattered among half a dozen families, were the only remaining clue connecting him with his native town. He could now be Jonathan Briggs indeed. Only who was Jonathan Briggs, and how was he to earn a living under these unexpected conditions? At the end of a couple of days he was dexterously landed on the end of a long pier, which they passed without stopping, on their way to their own obscure anchorage. As he jumped from the rail to the pier and felt again the touch of terra firma, he drew a long breath of uncontrollable elation. Yet he had not a cent in the world, no friends, and certainly no prospects. He did not even know whether to turn to the right or the left as he stepped out upon the docks, and when he had decided to turn to the right, as being on the whole more lucky, he did not know whether to risk his fortune in the streets of the town or to plunge into one of the low-browed drinking-houses whose signs confronted him on this water lane. He decided that his prospects for a dinner were slim in any case, and that his only hope of breaking fast that day lay in the use he might make of one of his three talents. Either he must find a fiddle to play on, a carpenter's bench to work at, or a piece of detective shadowing to do. The last would bring him before the notice of the police, which was just the thing he must avoid. So it was fiddling or carpentry he must seek, either of which would be difficult to obtain in his present garb. But of difficulties Sweetwater was not a man to take note. He had undertaken out of pure love for a good man to lose himself. He had accomplished this, and now was he to complain because in doing so he was likely to go hungry for a day or two? No. Annabel might laugh at him, or he might fancy she did, while struggling in the midst of rapidly engulfing waters, but would she laugh at him now? He did not think she would. She was of the kind who sometimes goes hungry themselves in old age. Some premonition of this might give her a fellow feeling. He came to a stand before a little child sitting on an ill-kept doorstep. Smiling at her kindly, he waited for her first expression, to see how he appeared in the eyes of innocence. Not so bad a man, it seemed, though his naturally plain countenance was not relieved by the seaman's cap and knitted shirt he wore, for she laughed as she looked at him, and only ran away because there wasn't room for him to pass beside her. Comforted a little, he sauntered on, glancing here and there with that sharp eye of his for a piece of work to be done. Suddenly he came to a halt. A market woman had gotten into an altercation with an oysterman, and her stall had been upset in the contention, and her vegetables were rolling here and there. He righted her stall, picked up her vegetables, and in return got 2 apples and a red herring he would not have given to a dog at home. Yet it was the sweetest morsel he had ever tasted, and the apples might have been grown in the garden of the Hesperides, from the satisfaction and pleasure they gave this hungry man. Then, refreshed, he dashed into the town. It should now go hard, but he would earn a night's lodging. The day was windy, and he was going along a narrow street when something floated down from a window above past his head. It was a woman's veil, and as he looked up to see where it came from, he met the eyes of its owner looking down from an open casement above him. She was gesticulating, and seemed to point to someone up the street. Glad to seize of anything which promised emolument or adventure, he shouted up and asked her what she wanted. "That man down there," she cried, "the one in a long black coat going up the street. Keep after him and stop him. Tell him the telegram has come. Quick, quick, before he gets around the corner. He will pay you. Run!" Sweetwater, with joy in his heart, for 5 cents was a boon to him in the present condition of his affairs, rushed after the man she had pointed out and hastily stopped him. "Someone," he added, "a woman in a window back there, Bade me run after you and say the telegram has come. She told me you would pay me," he added, for he saw the man was turning hastily back without thinking of the messenger. "I need the money, and the run was a sharp one." With a preoccupied air, the man thrust his hand into his pocket, pulled out a coin, and handed it to him. Then he walked hurriedly off. Evidently the news was welcome to him, but Sweetwater stood rooted to the ground. The man had given him a $5 gold piece instead of the nickel he had evidently intended. How hungrily Sweetwater eyed that coin! It was lodging, food, perhaps a new article or so of clothing. But after a moment of indecision, which might well be forgiven him, he followed speedily after the man and overtook him just as he reached the house from which the woman's veil had floated. "Sir, pardon me, but you gave me $5 instead of 5 cents. It was a mistake. I cannot keep the money." The man, who was not just the sort from whom kindness would be expected, looked at the money in Sweetwater's palm, then at the miserable, mud-bespattered clothes he wore. He had got that mud helping the poor market woman, and stared hard at the face of the man who looked so needy and yet returned him $5. "You're an honest fellow," he declared, not offering to take back the gold piece. Then, with a quick glance up at the window, "Would you like to earn that money?" Sweetwater broke out into a smile, which changed his whole countenance. "Wouldn't I, sir?" The man eyed him for another minute with scrutinizing intensity. Then he said shortly, "Come upstairs with me." They entered the house, went up a flight or two, and stopped at a door which was slightly ajar. "We are going into the presence of a lady," remarked the man. "Wait here until I call you." Sweetwater waited, the many thoughts going through his mind not preventing him from observing all that passed. The man, who had left the door wide open, approached the lady who was awaiting him, and who was apparently the same one who had sent Sweetwater on his errand, and entered in a low but animated conversation. She held a telegram in her hand which she showed him, and then, after a little earnest parley, and a number of pleading looks from them both toward the waiting Sweetwater, she disappeared into another room, from which she brought a parcel neatly done up, which she handed to the man with a strange gesture. Another hurried exchange of words, and a meaning look which did not escape the sharp eye of the watchful messenger, and the man turned and gave the parcel into Sweetwater's hands. "You are to carry this," said he, "to the town hall. In the second room to the right on entering you will see a table surrounded by chairs, which at this hour ought to be empty. At the head of the table you will find an armchair. On the table directly in front of this you will lay this packet. Mark you, directly before the chair and not too far from the edge of the table. Then you are to come out. If you see anyone, say you came to leave some papers for Mr. Gifford. Do this, and you may keep the $5 and welcome." Sweetwater hesitated. There was something in the errand or in the manner of the man and woman that he did not like. "Don't potter," spoke up the latter, with an impatient look at her watch. "Mr. Gifford will expect those papers." Sweetwater's sensitive fingers closed on the package he held. It did not feel like papers. "Are you going?" asked the man. Sweetwater looked up with a smile. "Large pay for so slight a commission," he ventured, turning the packet over and over in his hand. "But then you will execute it at once, and according to the instructions I have given you," retorted the man. "It is your trustworthiness I pay for. Now go." Sweetwater turned to go. After all, it was probably all right, and $5 easily earned is doubly $5. As he reached the staircase he stumbled. The shoes he wore did not fit him. "Be careful there!" shouted the woman, in a shrill, almost frightened voice, while the man stumbled back into the room in a haste which seemed wholly uncalled for. "If you let the packet fall you will do injury to its contents. Go softly, man, go softly." Yet they had said it contained papers. Troubled, yet hardly knowing what his duty was, Sweetwater hastened down the stairs and took his way up the street. The town hall should be easy to find. Indeed, he thought he saw it in the distance. As he went, he asked himself two questions. Could he fail to deliver the package according to instructions and yet earn his money? And was there any way of so delivering it without risk to the recipient, or dereliction of duty to the man who had entrusted it to him and whose money he wished to earn? To the first question his conscience at once answered no. To the second the reply came more slowly, and before fixing his mind determinedly upon it, he asked himself why he felt that this was no ordinary commission. He could answer readily enough. First, the pay was too large. Arguing that either the packet or the placing of the packet in a certain position on Mr. Gifford's table was of uncommon importance to this man or this woman. Secondly, the woman, though plainly and inconspicuously clad, had the face of a more than ordinarily unscrupulous adventuress, while her companion was one of those saturnine-faced men we sometimes meet, whose first look puts us on our guard, and whom, if we hope nothing from him, we instinctively shun. Third, they did not look like inhabitants of the house and rooms in which he had found them. Nothing beyond the necessary articles of furniture was to be seen there, not a trunk, not an article of clothing, nor any of the little things that mark a woman's presence in a spot where she expects to spend a day or even an hour. Consequently, they were transients, and perhaps already in the act of flight. Then he was being followed. Of this he felt sure. He had followed people himself, and something in his own sensations assured him that his movements were under surveillance. It would, therefore, not do to show any consciousness of this, and he went on directly and as straight to his goal as his rather limited knowledge of the streets would allow. He was determined to earn this money and to earn it without disadvantage to anyone, and he thought he saw his way. At the entrance of the town hall he hesitated an instant. An officer was standing in the doorway. It would be easy to call his attention to the packet he held and ask him to keep his eye on it. But this might involve him with the police, and this was something, as we know, which the man was more than anxious to avoid. He reverted to his first idea. Mixing with the crowd just now hurrying to and fro through the long corridors, he reached the room designated and found it, as he had been warned he should, empty. Approaching the table, he laid down the packet just as he had been directed, in front of the big armchair, and then, casting a hurried look towards the door, and failing to find anyone watching him, he took up a pencil lying near by and scrawled hastily across the top of the packet the word "suspicious." This he calculated would act as a warning to Mr. Gifford in case there was anything wrong about the package, and pass as a joke with him and even the sender if there was not. And satisfied that he had both earned his money and done justice to his own apprehensions, he turned to retrace his steps. As before, the corridors were alive with hurrying men of various ages and appearance, but only two attracted his notice. One of these was a large, intellectual-looking man who turned into the room from which he had just emerged, and the other a short, fair man with a countenance he had known from boyhood. Mr. Stone, of Sutherlandtown, was within 10 paces of him, and he was as well known to the good postmaster as the postmaster was to him. Could anyone have foreseen such a chance? Turning his back with a slow slouch, he made for a rear door he saw swinging in and out before him. As he passed through, he cast a quick look behind him. He had not been recognized. In great relief he rushed on, knocking against a man standing against one of the outside pillars. "Halloo!" shouted the man. Sweetwater stopped. There was a tone of authority in the voice which he could not resist. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Chapter 28. The Adventure of the Scrap of Paper and the Three Words. What are you trying to do? Why did you fall over a man like that? Are you drunk? Sweetwater drew himself up, made a sheepish bow, and muttered paintingly, "Excuse me, sir. I am in a hurry. I'm a messenger." The man, who was not in a hurry, seemed disposed to keep him for a moment. He had caught sight of Sweetwater's eye, which was his own one remarkable feature, and he had also been impressed by that word messenger, for he repeated it with some emphasis. "A messenger, eh? Are you going on a message now?" Sweetwater, who was anxious to get away from the vicinity of Mr. Stone, shrugged his shoulders in careless denial, and was pushing on when the gentleman again detained him. "Do you know," said he, "that I like your looks? You are not a beauty, but you look like a fellow who, if he promised to do a thing, would do it, and do it mighty well, too." Sweetwater could not restrain a certain movement of pride. He was honest, and he knew it, but the fact had not always been so openly recognized. "I have just earned $5 by doing a commission for a man," said he, with a straightforward look. "See, sir, it was honestly earned." The man, who was young and had a rather dashing but inscrutable physiognomy, glanced at the coin Sweetwater showed him and betrayed a certain disappointment. "So you're flush," said he. "Don't want another job?" "Oh, as to that," said Sweetwater, edging slowly down the street, "I'm always ready for business. $5 won't last forever, and besides, I am in need of new togs." "Well, rather," retorted the other carelessly, following him. "Do you mind going up to Boston?" "Boston!" Another jump toward home. "No," said Sweetwater hesitatingly. "Not if it's made worth my while. Do you want your message delivered today?" "At once, that is, this evening. It's a task involving patience and more or less shrewd judgment. Have you these qualities, my friend? One would not judge it from your clothes." "My clothes!" laughed Sweetwater. Life was growing very interesting all at once. "I know it takes patience to wear them, and as for any lack of judgment I may show in their choice, I should just like to say I did not choose them myself, sir. They fell to me promiscuous like, as a sort of legacy from friends. You'll see what I'll do in that way if you give me the chance to earn an extra 10. "Ah, it's $10 you want. Well, come in here and have a drink, and then we'll see." They were before a saloon house of less than humble pretensions, and as he followed the young gentleman in it struck him that it was himself rather than his well-dressed and airy companion who would be expected to drink here. But he made no remark, though he intended to surprise the man by his temperance. "Now, look here," said the young gentleman, suddenly seating himself at a dingy table in a very dark corner and motioning Sweetwater to do the same. "I've been looking for a man all day to go up to Boston for me, and I think you'll do. You know Boston?" Sweetwater had great command over himself, but he flushed slightly at this question, though it was so dark where he sat with this man that it made very little difference. "I have been there," said he. "Very well, then, you will go again tonight. You will arrive there about 7. You will go to the rounds of some half a dozen places whose names I will give you, and when you come across a certain gentleman whom I will describe to you, you will give him—" "Not a package?" Sweetwater broke out with a certain sort of dread of a repetition of his late experience. "No, this slip on which 2 words are written. He will want one more word, but before you give it to him you must ask for your $10. You'll get them," he answered in response to a glance of suspicion from Sweetwater. Sweetwater was convinced that he had got hold of another suspicious job. It made him a little serious. "Do I look like a go-between for crooks?" he asked himself. "I'm afraid I'm not so much of a success as I thought myself." But he said to the man before him, $10 is small pay for such business. 25 would be nearer the mark." "Very well, he will give you $25. I forgot that $10 was but little in advance of your expenses." "25 if I find him, and he is in funds. What if I don't?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" "Except your ticket that I'll give you." Sweetwater did not know what to say. Like the preceding job, it might be innocent and it might not. And then he did not like going to Boston, where he was liable to meet more than one who knew him. "There is no harm in the business," observed the other carelessly, pushing a glass of whiskey which had just been served him toward Sweetwater. "I would even be willing to do it myself if I could leave New Bedford tonight. But I can't. Come, it's as easy as crooking your elbow." "Just now you said it wasn't," growled Sweetwater, drinking from his glass. "But no matter about that. Go ahead, I'll do it. Shall I have to buy other clothes?" "I'd buy a new pair of trousers," suggested the other. "The rest you can get in Boston. You don't want to be too much in evidence, you know." Sweetwater agreed with him. To attract attention was what he most dreaded. "When does the train start?" he asked. The young man told him. "Well, that will give me time to buy what I want. Now, what are your instructions?" The young man gave him a memorandum containing 4 addresses. "You will find him at one of these places," said he. "And now, to know your man when you see him. He is a large, handsome fellow with red hair and a mustache like the devil. He has been hurt and wears his left hand in a sling, but he can play cards, and will be found playing cards, and in very good company too. You will have to use your discretion in approaching him. When once he sees this bit of paper, all will be easy. He knows that these 2 words mean well enough. And the third one, the one that is worth $25 to you, is Fredrick." Sweetwater, who had drunk half his glass, started so at this word, which was always humming in his brain, that he knocked over his tumbler and spilled what was left in it. I hope I won't forget that word," he remarked, in a careless tone, intended to carry off his momentary show of feeling. "If you do, then don't expect the $25," retorted the other, finishing his own glass, but not offering to renew Sweetwater's. Sweetwater laughed, said he thought he could trust his memory, and rose. In a half an hour he was at the depot, and in another 15 minutes speeding out of New Bedford on his way to Boston. He had had but one anxiety, that Mr. Stone might be going up to Boston too. But once relieved of this apprehension he settled back, and for the first time in 12 hours had a minute in which to ask himself who he was and what he was about. Adventure had followed so fast upon adventure that he was in a more or less dazed condition, and felt as little capable of connecting event with event as if he had been asked to recall the changing pictures of a kaleidoscope. That affair of the packet, now, was it or was it not serious, and would he ever know what it meant or how it turned out? Like a child who had been given a pebble and told to throw it over the wall, he had thrown and run, giving a shout of warning, it is true, but not knowing, nor ever likely to know, where the stone had fallen, or what it was meant to do. Then this new commission on which he was bent, was it in any way connected with the other, or merely the odd result of his being in the right place at the right moment? He was inclined to think the latter, and yet how odd it was that one doubtful errand should be followed by another, in a town no larger than New Bedford, forcing him from scene to scene, till he found himself speeding toward the city he least desired to enter, and from which he had the most fear. But brooding over a case like this brings small comfort. He felt that he had been juggled with, but he neither knew by whose hand nor in what cause. If the hand was that of Providence, why he had only to go on following the beck of the moment, while if it was that of Fate, the very uselessness of struggling with it was apparent at once. Poor reasoning perhaps, but no other offered, and satisfied that whatever came his intentions were above question, he settled himself at last for a nap, of which he certainly stood in good need. When he awoke he was in Boston. The first thing he did was to show his list of addresses and inquire into what quarter they would lead him. To his surprise he found it to be the fashionable quarter. Two of them were names of well-known club houses, a third that of a first-class restaurant, and the fourth that of a private house on Commonwealth Avenue. Hey-go! And he was dressed like a tramp, or nearly so. Queer messenger I for such kind of work, thought he. I wonder why he lighted on such a rough-looking customer. He must have had his reasons. I wonder if he wished the errand to fail. He bore himself very nonchalantly at the depot. When I last saw him his face and attitude were those of a totally unconcerned man. Have I been sent on a fool's chase after all? The absurdity of this conclusion struck him, however, as he reasoned. Why, then, should he have paid my fare? Not as a benefit to me, of course, but for his own ends, whatever they might be. Let us see, then, what those ends are. So now for the gentleman of the red hair who plays cards with one arm in a sling. He thought that he might get entrance into the club houses easily enough. He possessed a certain amount of insinuation when necessity required, and, if hard featured, had a good expression which in unprejudiced minds defied criticism. Of porters and doorkeepers he was not afraid, and these were the men he must first encounter. At the first club house he succeeded easily enough in getting word with the man waiting in the large hall, and before many minutes learned that the object of his search was not to be found there that evening. He also learned his name, which was a great step towards the success of his embassy. It was Wattles, Captain Wattles, a marked man evidently, even in this exclusive and aristocratic club. Armed with this new knowledge, he made his way to the second building of the kind and boldly demanded speech with Captain Wattles. But Captain Wattles had not yet arrived, and he went out again, this time to look him up at the restaurant. He was not there. As Sweetwater was going out, two gentlemen came in, one of whom said to the other in passing, "Sick, do you say? I thought Wattles was made of iron." "So he was," returned the other, "before that accident to his arm. Now the least thing upsets him. He's down at Haberstow's." That was all. The door was swung to between them. Sweetwater had received his clue. But what a clue! Haberstow. Where is that? Thinking the bold course the best one, he re-entered the restaurant and approached the gentleman he had just seen enter. "I heard you speak the name of Captain Wattles," said he. "I am hunting for Captain Wattles. Can you tell me where he is?" He soon saw that he had struck the wrong men for information. They not only refused to answer him, but treated him with open disdain. Unwilling to lose time, he left them, and having no other resource hastened to the last place mentioned on his list. It was now late, too late to enter a private house under ordinary circumstances, but this house was lighted up, and a carriage stood in front of it. So he had the courage to run up the steps and consult the large door plate visible from the sidewalk. It read thus: Haberstow. Fortune had favored him better than he expected. He hesitated a moment, then decided to ring the bell, but before he had done so, the door opened and an old gentleman appeared, seeing a younger man out. The latter had his arm in a sling and bore himself with a fierceness that made his appearance somewhat alarming. The other seemed to be in an irate state of mind. "No apologies," the former was saying. "I don't mind the night air. I am not so ill as that. When I am myself again we'll have a little more talk. My compliments to your daughter, sir. I wish you a very good evening, or rather night." The old gentleman bowed, and as he did so Sweetwater caught a glimpse, it was the shortest glimpse in the world, of a sweet face beaming from a doorway far down the hall. There was pain in it and a yearning anxiety that made it very beautiful. Then it was vanished, and the old gentleman, uttering some few sarcastic words, closed the door, and Sweetwater found himself alone and in darkness. The kaleidoscope had been given another turn. Dashing down the stoop, he came upon the gentleman who had preceded him, just as he was seating himself in the carriage. "Pardon me," he gasped as the driver caught up the reins. "You have forgotten something." Then, as Captain Wattles looked hastily out, "You have forgotten me." The oath that rang out from under that twitching red moustache was something to startle even him, but he clung to the carriage window and presently managed to say: "A messenger, sir, from New Bedford. I have been on the hunt for you for 2 hours. It won't keep, sir, for more than a half hour longer. Where shall I find you during that time?" Captain Wattles, on whom the name New Bedford seemed to have made some impression, pointed up at the coachman's box with a growl, in which command mingled strangely with menace. Then he threw himself back. Evidently the captain was not in very good humour. Sweetwater, taking this as an order to seat himself beside the driver, did so, and the carriage drove off. It went at a rapid pace, and before he had time to propound more than a question or two to the coachman, it stopped before a large apartment house in a brilliantly lighted street. Captain Wattles got out, and Sweetwater followed him. The former, who seemed to have forgotten Sweetwater, walked past him and entered the building with a stride and swing that made the plain, lean, insignificant looking messenger behind him feel smaller than ever. Indeed, he had never felt so small, for not only was the captain a man of superb proportions and conspicuous bearing, but he possessed, in spite of his fiery hair and fierce moustache, that beauté de diable which is at once threatening and imposing. Added to this, he was angry and so absorbed in his own thoughts that he would be very apt to visit punishment of no light character upon anyone who interfered with him. A pleasing prospect for Sweetwater, who, however, kept on with the dogged determination of his character up the first flight of stairs and then up another till they stopped, Captain Wattles first and afterwards his humble follower, before a small door into which the captain endeavoured to fit a key. The oaths which followed his failure to do this were not very encouraging to the man behind, nor was the kick which he gave the door after the second more successful attempt calculated to act in a very reassuring way upon anyone whose future pay for a doubtful task rested upon this man's good nature. The darkness which met them both on the threshold of this now open room was speedily relieved by a burst of electric light that flooded the whole apartment and brought out the captain's swaggering form and threatening features with startling distinctness. He had thrown off his hat and was relieving himself of a cloak in a furious way that caused Sweetwater to shrink back, and, as the French say, efface himself as much as possible behind a clothes tree standing near the door. That the captain had entirely forgotten him was evident, and for the present moment that gentleman was too angry to care or even notice if a dozen men stood at the door. As he was talking all this time, or rather jerking out sharp sentences as men do when in a towering rage, Sweetwater was glad to be left unnoticed, for much can be gathered from scattered sentences, especially when a man is in too reckless a frame of mind to weigh them. He, therefore, made but little movement and listened, and these are some of the ejaculations and scraps of talk he heard. "The old purse-proud fool, honoured by my friendship, but not ready to accept me as his daughter's suitor, as if I would lounge away hours that mean dollars to me in his stiff old drawing-room, just to hear his everlasting drone about stocks up and stocks down, and politics gone all wrong. He has heard that I play cards, and how pretty she looked. I believe I have liked that girl, and when I think she has $1,000,000 in her own right, damn it, if I cannot win her openly and with papa's consent, I will carry her off with only her own. She is worth the effort, doubly worth it. And when I have her and her money, hey, who are you?" He had seen Sweetwater at last, which was not strange, seeing that he had turned his way and was within 2 feet of him. "What are you doing here, and who let you in?" Get out, or a message, Captain Wattles, a message from New Bedford. You have forgotten, sir? You bade me to follow you." It was curious to see the menace slowly die out of the face of this flushed and angry man as he met Sweetwater's calm eye and unabashed front, and noticed, as he had not done at first, the slip of paper which the latter resolutely held out. "New Bedford? Ah, from Campbell. I take it. Let me see." And the hand which had shook with rage now trembled with a very different sort of emotion as he took the slip, cast his eyes over it, and then looked back at Sweetwater. Now Sweetwater knew the two words written on that paper. He could see out of the back of his head at times, and he had been able to make out these words when the man in New Bedford was writing them. Happenings, Afghanistan, with the figures 2000 after the latter. Not much sense in them singly or in conjunction, but the captain, muttering them over to himself, consulted a little book which he took from his breast pocket and found, or seemed to, a clue to their meaning. It could only have been a partial one, however, for in another instant he turned on Sweetwater with a sour look and a thundering oath. "Is this all?" he shouted. "Does he call this a complete message?" "There is another word," returned Sweetwater, "which he bade me give you by word of mouth, but that word don't go for nothing. It's worth just $25. I've earned it, sir. I came up from New Bedford on purpose to deliver it to you." Sweetwater expected a blow, but he only got a stare. $25, muttered the captain. "Well, it's fortunate that I have them. And who are you?" he asked. "Not one of Campbell's pickups, surely?" "I am a confidential messenger," smiled Sweetwater, amused against his will at finding a name for himself. "I carry messages and execute commissions that require more or less discretion in the handling. I am paid well. $25 is the price of this job." "So you have had the honor of informing me before," blustered the other with an attempt to hide some serious emotion. "Why, man, what do you fear? Don't you see I'm hurt? You could knock me over with a feather if you touched my game arm." $25, repeated Sweetwater. The captain grew angrier. "Dash it! Aren't you going to have them? What's the word?" But Sweetwater wasn't going to be caught by chaff. "COD," he insisted firmly, standing his ground, though certain that the blow would now fall. But no, the captain laughed, and tugging away with one free hand at his pocket, he brought out a pocket book, from which he managed deftly enough to draw out 3 bills. "There," said he, laying them on the table, but keeping one long vigorous finger on them. "Now the word." Sweetwater laid his own hand on the bills. "Fredrick," said he. "Ah," said the other thoughtfully, lifting his finger and proceeding to stride up and down the room. "He's a stiff one. What he says he will do. $2,000, and soon, too, I warrant. Well, I'm in a devil of a fix at last." He had again forgotten the presence of Sweetwater. Suddenly he turned, or rather stopped. His eye was on the messenger, but he did not even see him. "One Fredrick must offset the other," he cried. "It's the only loophole out." And he threw himself into a chair from which he immediately sprang up again with a yell. He had hurt his wounded arm. Pandemonium reigned in that small room for a minute. Then his eye fell again on Sweetwater, who, under the fascination of the spectacle offered him, had only just succeeded in finding the knob of the door. This time there was a recognition in his look. "Wait!" he cried. "I may have use for you too. Confidential messengers are hard to come by, and one that Campbell would employ must be all right. Sit down there. I'll talk to you when I am ready." Sweetwater was not slow in obeying this command. Business was booming with him. Besides, the name of Fredrick acted like a charm upon him. There seemed to be so many Fredricks in the world, and one of them lay in such a curious way near his heart. Meanwhile the captain reseated himself, but more carefully. He had a plan or method of procedure to think out, or so it seemed, for he sat a long time in rigid immobility, with only the scowl of perplexity or ill temper on his brow to show the nature of his thoughts. Then he drew a sheet of paper toward him and began to write a letter. He was so absorbed over this letter and the manipulation of it, having but one hand to work with, that Sweetwater determined upon a hazardous stroke. The little book which the captain had consulted, and which had undoubtedly furnished him with a key to those two incongruous words, lay on the floor not far from him, having been flung from its owner's hand during the moments of passion and suffering I have above mentioned. To reach this book with his foot, to draw it toward him, and finally to get hold of it with his hand, was not difficult for one who aspired to be a detective, and had already done some good work in that direction. But it was harder to turn the leaves and find the words he sought without attracting the attention of his fierce companion. He, however, succeeded in doing this at last, the long list of words he found on every page being arranged alphabetically. It was a private code for telegraphic or cable messages, and he soon found out that happenings meant our little game discovered, play straight until I give you the wink, and that Afghanistan stood for hush money. As the latter was followed by the figures I have mentioned, the purport of the message needed no explanation, but the word Fredrick did, so he searched for that, only to find that it was not in the book. There was but one conclusion to draw. This name was perfectly well known between them, and was that of the person, no doubt, who laid claim to the $2,000. Satisfied at holding this clue to the riddle, he dropped the book again at his side and skillfully kicked it far out into the room. Captain Wattles had seen nothing. He was a man who took in only one thing at a time. The penning of that letter went on laboriously. It took so long that Sweetwater dozed, or pretended to, and when it was at last done, the clock on the mantelpiece had struck 2. "Hello there now," suddenly shouted the captain, turning on the messenger. "Are you ready for another journey?" "That depends," smiled Sweetwater, rising sleepily and advancing. "Haven't got over the last one yet, and would rather sleep than start out again." "Oh, you want pay? Well, you'll get that fast enough if you succeed in your mission. This letter," he shook it with an impatient hand, "should be worth $2,500 to me. If you bring me back that money or its equivalent within 24 hours, I will give you a clean 100 of it." "Good enough pay, I take it, for 5 hours' journey. Better than sleep, eh? Besides, you can doze on the cars." Sweetwater agreed with him in all these assertions. Putting on his cap, he reached for the letter. He didn't like being made an instrument for blackmail, but he was curious to see to whom he was about to be sent. But the captain had grown suddenly wary. "This is not a letter to be dropped in the mailbox," said he. "You brought me a line here whose prompt delivery has prevented me from making a fool of myself tonight." You must do as much with this one. It is to be carried to its destination by yourself, given to the person whose name you will find written on it, and the answer brought back before you sleep. Mind you, unless you snatch a wink or so on the cars. That it is night need not disturb you. It will be daylight before you arrive at the place to which this is addressed, and if you cannot get into the house at so early an hour, whistle 3 times like this. Listen, and one of the windows will presently fly up. You have had no trouble finding me, you'll have no trouble finding him. When you return, hunt me up as you did tonight. Only you need not trouble yourself to look for me at Haberstow's," he added under his breath in a tone that was no doubt highly satisfactory to himself. "I shall not be there, and now, off with you," he shouted. "You've your $100 to make before daylight, and it's already after 2." Sweetwater, who had stolen a glimpse at the superscription on the letter he held, stumbled as he went out of the door. It was directed, as he had expected, to a Fredrick, probably to the second one of whom Captain Wattles had spoken, but not, as he had expected, to a stranger. The name on the letter was Frederick Sutherland, and the place of his destination was Sutherlandtown. End of chapter 28. The Adventure of the Scrap of Paper and the 3 Words. Recorded by Gabby Cowan. Section 29 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Chapter 29. Who are you? The round had come full circle. By various chances and a train of circumstances for which he could not account, he had been turned from his first intention and was being brought back stage by stage to the very spot he had thought it his duty to fly from. Was this fate? He began to think so, and no longer so much as dreamed of struggling against it. But he felt very much dazed, and walked away through the now partially deserted streets with an odd sense of failure that was only compensated by the hope he now cherished of seeing his mother again, and being once more Caleb Sweetwater of Sutherlandtown. He was clearer, however, after a few blocks of rapid walking, and then he began to wonder over the contents of the letter he held, and how they would affect its recipient. Was it a new danger he was bringing him? Instead of aiding Mr. Sutherland in keeping his dangerous secret, was he destined to bring disgrace upon him, not only by his testimony before the coroner, but by means of this letter, which, whatever it contained, certainly could not bode good to the man from whom it was designed to wrest $2,500? The fear that he was destined to do so grew upon him rapidly, and the temptation to open the letter and make himself master of its contents before leaving town at last became so strong that his sense of honor paled before it, and he made up his mind that before he ventured into the precincts of Sutherlandtown he would know just what sort of a bombshell he was carrying into the Sutherland family. To do this, he stopped at the first respectable lodging house he encountered and hired a room, calling for hot water, piping hot, he told them. He subjected the letter to the effects of steam, and presently had it open. He was not disappointed in its contents, save that they were even more dangerous than he had anticipated. Captain Wattles was an old crony of Fredrick's and knew his record better than anyone else in the world. From this fact, and the added one that Fredrick had stood in special need of money at the time of Agatha Webb's murder, the writer had no hesitation in believing him guilty of the crime which opened his way to a fortune. And though under ordinary circumstances he would, as his friend Fredrick already knew, be perfectly willing to keep his opinions to himself, he was just now under the same necessity for money that Fredrick had been at that fatal time, and must therefore see the color of $2,500 before the day was out if Fredrick desired to have his name kept out of the Boston papers. That it had been kept out up to this time argued that the crime had been well enough hidden to make the alternative thus offered an important one. There was no signature. Sweetwater, affected to an extent he little expected, resealed the letter, made his excuses to the landlord, and left the house. Now he could see why he had not been allowed to make his useless sacrifice. Another man than himself suspected Fredrick, and by a word could precipitate the doom he already saw hung too low above the devoted head of Mr. Sutherland's son to be averted. "Yet I'll attempt that too," burst impetuously from his lips. "If I fail, I can but go back with a knowledge of this added danger. If I succeed, why, I must still go back. From some persons and from some complications, it is useless to attempt flight." Returning to the clubhouse he had first entered in his search for Captain Wattles, he asked if that gentleman had yet come in. This time he was answered by an affirmative, though he might almost as well have not been, for the captain was playing cards in a private room and would not submit to any interruption. "He will submit to mine," retorted Sweetwater to the man who had told him this. "Or wait, hand him back this letter and say that the messenger refuses to deliver it." This brought the captain out, as he had fully expected it would. "Why, what—" began that gentleman in a furious rage. But Sweetwater, laying his hand on the arm he knew to be so sensitive, rose on tiptoe and managed to whisper in the angry man's ear, "You are a card sharp, and it will be easy enough to ruin you. Threaten Frederick Sutherland, and in 2 weeks you will be boycotted by every club in this city. $2,500 won't pay you for that." This from a nondescript fellow with no grains of a gentleman about him in form, feature, or apparel. The captain stared nonplussed, too much taken aback to be angry. Suddenly he cried, "How do you know all this? How do you know what is or it is not in the letter I gave you?" Sweetwater, with a shrug that in its quiet significance seemed to make him at once the equal of his interrogator, quietly pressed the quivering limb under his hand and calmly replied, "I know because I have read it. Before putting my head in the lion's mouth, I make it a point to count his teeth." And lifting his hand, he drew back, leaving the captain reeling. "What is your name? Who are you?" shouted out Wattles as Sweetwater was drawing off. It was the 3rd time he had been asked that question within 24 hours, but not before with this telling emphasis. "Who are you, I say, and what can you do to me?" "I am—" "But that is an insignificant detail unworthy of your curiosity. As to what I can do, wait and see. But first, burn that letter." And turning his back, he fled out of the building, followed by oaths which, if not loud, were certainly deep and very far reaching. It was the first time that Captain Wattles had met his match in audacity. End of chapter 29. Who are you? Recorded by Gabby Cowan.
Section 30 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Agatha Webb by Anna Katharine Green. Home again. On his way to the depot, Sweetwater went into the Herald office and bought a morning paper. At the station he opened it. There was one column devoted to the wreck of the Hesper, and a whole half page to the proceedings of the third day's inquiry into the cause and manner of Agatha Webb's death. Merely noting that his name was mentioned among the lost in the first article, he began to read the latter with justifiable eagerness. The assurance given in Captain Wattles' letter was true. No direct suspicion had as yet fallen on Fredrick. As the lover of Amabel Page, his name was necessarily mentioned, but neither in the account of the inquest nor in the editorials on the subject could he find any proof that either the public or police had got hold of the great idea that he was the man who had preceded Amabel to Agatha's cottage. Relieved on this score, Sweetwater entered more fully into the particulars, and found that though the jury had sat 3 days, very little more had come to light than was known on the morning he made that bold dash into the Hesper. Most of the witnesses had given their testimony, Amabel's being the chief, and though no open accusation had been made, it was evident from the trend of the questions put to the latter that Amabel's connection with the affair was looked upon as criminal and as placing her in a very suspicious light. Her replies, however, as once before, under a similar but less formal examination, failed to convey any recognition on her part either of this suspicion or of her own position, yet they were not exactly frank, and Sweetwater saw, or thought he saw, naturally failing to have a key to the situation, that she was still working upon her old plan of saving both herself and Fredrick by throwing whatever suspicion her words might raise upon the deceased Zabel. He did not know, and perhaps it was just as well that he did not at this especial juncture, that she was only biding her time, now very nearly at hand, and that instead of loving Fredrick she hated him, and was determined upon his destruction. Reading, as a final clause, that Mr. Sutherland was expected to testify soon in explanation of his position as executor of Mrs. Webb's will, Sweetwater grew very serious, and while no change took place in his mind as to his present duty, he decided that his return must be as unobtrusive as possible, and his only too timely reappearance on the scene of the inquiry kept secret till Mr. Sutherland had given his evidence and retired from under the eyes of his excited fellow citizens. The sight of me might unnerve him, was Sweetwater's thought, precipitating the very catastrophe we dread. One look, one word on his part indicative of his inner apprehensions that his son had a hand in the crime which has so benefited him, and nothing can save Fredrick from the charge of murder. Not Knapp's skill, my silence, or Amabel's finesse. The young man will be lost. He did not know, as we do, that Amabel's finesse was devoted to winning a husband for herself, and that, in the event of failure, the action she threatened against her quondam lover would be precipitated that very day at the moment when the clock struck 12. Sweetwater arrived home by the way of Portchester. He had seen one or two persons he knew, but so far had himself escaped recognition. The morning light was dimly breaking when he strode into the outskirts of Sutherlandtown and began to descend the hill. As he passed Mr. Halliday's house he looked up, and was astonished to see a light burning in one deeply embowered window. Alas! He did not know how early one anxious heart woke during those troublous days. The Sutherland house was dark, but as he crept very close under its overhanging eaves he heard a deep sigh uttered over his head, and knew that someone was up here also in anxious expectation of a day that was destined to hold more than even he anticipated. Meanwhile the sea grew rosy, and the mother's cottage was as yet far off. Hurrying on, he came at last under the eye of more than one of the early risers of Sutherlandtown. What, Sweetwater, alive and well? Hey, Sweetwater, we thought you were lost on the Hesper. Hello, home in time to see the pretty Amabel arrested? Phrases like these met him at more than one corner, but he eluded them all, stopping only to put one hesitating question. Was his mother well? Home fears had made themselves felt with his near approach to that humble cottage door. End section 30.
Section 31 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Agatha Webb by Anna Catherine Green. What followed the striking of the clock. Recording by Shivansh Dhar. It was the last day of the inquest, and to many it bade fair to be the least interesting. All the witnesses who had anything to say had long ago given in their testimony, and when at or near noon, Sweetwater slid into the inconspicuous seat he had succeeded in obtaining near the coroner, it was to find in two faces only any signs of the eagerness and expectancy which filled his own breast to suffocation. But as these faces were those of Agnes Halliday and Amabel Page, he soon recognized that his own judgment was not at fault, and that notwithstanding outward appearances and the languid interest shown in the now lagging proceedings, the moment presaged an event full of unseen but vital consequence. Fredrick was not visible in the great hall, but that he was near at hand soon became evident from the change Sweetwater now saw in Amabel. For while she had hitherto sat under the universal gaze with only the faint smile of conscious beauty on her inscrutable features, she roused as the hands of the clock moved towards noon, and glanced at the great door of entrance with an evil expectancy that startled even Sweetwater. So little had he really understood the nature of the passions laboring in that venomous breast. Next moment the door opened, and Fredrick and his father came in. The air of triumphant satisfaction with which Amabel sank back into her seat was as marked in his character as her previous suspense. What did it mean? Sweetwater noted it, and the vivid contrast it offered to Frederick's air of depression, felt that his return had been well timed. But Fredrick, who was looking at Amabel, and his erect head and determined aspect made him a conspicuous figure in the room. She who had called up this expression, and alone comprehended fully, smiled as she met his eye, with that curious, slow dipping of her dimples, which had more than once confounded the coroner, and rendered her at once the admiration and abhorrence of the crowd, who for so long a time had the opportunity of watching her. Fredrick, to whom this smile conveyed a last hope as well as a last threat, looked away as soon as possible, but not before her eyes had fallen in their old inquiring ways to his hands, from which he had removed the ring which up to this hour he had invariably worn on his third finger. In this glance of hers and this action of his began the struggle that was to make the day memorable in many hearts. After the first stir occasioned by the entrance of two such important persons, the crowd settled back into its old quietude under the coroner's hand. A tedious witness was having his slow say, and to him a full attention was being given in the hope that some real enlightenment would come at last to settle the questions which had been raised by Amabel's incomplete and unsatisfactory testimony. But no man can furnish what he does not possess, and the few final minutes before noon passed by without any addition being made to the facts which had already been presented for general consideration. As the witness sat down, the clock began to strike. As the slow, hesitating strokes rang out, Sweetwater saw Fredrick yield to a sudden but most profound emotion. The old fear, which we understand, if Sweetwater did not, had again seized the victim of Amabel's ambition, and under her eye, which was blazing full upon him now with a fell and steady purpose, he found his right hand stealing toward the left in the significant action she expected. Better to yield than fall headlong into the pit one word of hers would open. He had not meant to yield, but now that the moment had come, now that he must at once and forever choose between a course that led simply to personal unhappiness and one that involved not only himself but those dearest to him, in disgrace and sorrow, he felt himself weakened to the point of clutching at whatever would save him from the consequences of confession. Moral strength and that tenacity of purpose which only comes from years of self-control were too lately awakened in his breast to sustain him now. As stroke after stroke fell on the ear, he felt himself yielding beyond recovery, and had almost touched his finger in the significant action of scent which Amabel awaited with breathless expectation. When? Was it miracle, or only the suggestion of his better nature? The memory of a face, full of holy pleading, rose from the past before his eyes, and with an inner cry of "Mother!" he flung his hand out and clutched his father's arm in a way to break the charm of his own dread, and end forever the effects of intolerable fascination that was working upon him. Next minute, the last stroke of noon rang out, and the hour was up which Amabel had set as the limit of her silence. A pause, which to their two hearts, if to no other, seemed strangely appropriate, followed the cessation of these sounds. Then the witness who was dismissed, and Amabel, taking advantage of the moment, was about to lean towards Mr. Courtney, when Fredrick, leaping with a bound to his feet, drew all eyes towards himself with the cry, "Let me be put on my oath. I have testimony to give of the utmost importance of this case." The coroner was astounded. Everyone was astounded. No one had expected anything from him, and instinctively every eye turned towards Amabel to see how she was affected by his action. Strangely, evidently, for the look with which she settled back in her seat was one which no one saw it ever forgot, though it conveyed no hint of her real feelings, which were somewhat chaotic. Fredrick, who had forgotten her now that he had made up his mind to speak, waited for the coroner's reply. "If you have testimony," said that gentleman after exchanging a few hurried words with Mr. Courtney and the surprised Knapp, "you can do no better than give it to us at once, Mr. Fredrick Sutherland. Will you take the stand?" With a noble air from which all hesitation had vanished, Fredrick started towards the place indicated, but stopped before he had taken half-dozen steps, and glanced back at his father, who was visibly succumbing under this last shock. "Go," he whispered, but in so thrilling a tone it was heard to the remotest corner of the room. "Spare me the anguish of saying what I have to say in your presence. I could not bear it. You could not bear it. Later, if you will wait for me in one of these rooms, I will repeat my tale in your ears. But go now. It is my last entreaty." There was a silence. No one ventured a dissent. No one so much as made a gesture of disapproval. Then Mr. Sutherland struggled to his feet, cast one last look around him, and disappeared through a door which had opened like magic before him. Then and not till then did Fredrick move forward. The moment was intense. The coroner seemed to share the universal excitement, but for his first question was a leading one, and brought out the startling admission. "I have obtruded myself into this inquiry, and now ask to be heard by this jury, because no man knows more than I do of the manner and cause of Agatha Webb's death. This you will believe when I tell you that I was the person Miss Page followed into Miss Webb's house, and whom she heard descend the stairs during the moment she crouched behind the figure of the sleeping Philemon." It was more, infinitely more than anyone there had expected. It was not only acknowledged, but a confession, and the shock, the surprise, the alarm which it occasioned even to those who had never much confidence in this young man's virtue was almost appalling in its intensity. Had it not been for the consciousness of Mr. Sutherland's near presence, the feeling would have risen to outbreak, and many voices were held in subjection by the remembrance of this venerated man's last look. that otherwise would have made themselves heard, in despite of the restrictions of the place and the authority of the police. To Fredrick, it was a moment of immeasurable grief and humiliation. On every face, in every shrinking form, in subdued murmurs and open cries he read instant and complete condemnation. And yet, in all his life, from boyhood to up to this hour, never had he been so worthy of their esteem and consideration. But though he felt iron enter his soul, he did not lose his determined attitude. He had observed a change in Amabel and a change in Agnes, and if only to disappoint the vile triumph of the one and raise against the drooping courage of the other, he withstood the clamor and began speaking again before the coroner had been able to fully restore quiet. "I know," said he, "what this acknowledgment must convey to the minds of the jury, people here assembled. But if anyone who listens to me thinks me guilty of the death I was so unfortunate as to have witnessed, he will be doing me a wrong which Agatha Webb would be first to condemn. Dr. Talbot, and you, gentlemen of the jury, in the face of God and man, I here declare that Mrs. Webb, in my presence and before my eyes, gave to herself the blow which has robbed us all of a most valuable life. She was not murdered." It was a solemn assertion, but it failed to convince the crowd before him, as by one impulse men and women broke into a tumult. Mr. Sutherland had forgotten in cries of "Never! She was too good! It's all calumny! A wretched lie!" broke into unrestrained excitement from every part of the large room. In vain the coroner smote with his gavel. In vain the local police endeavored to restore order. The tide was up and overswept everything for an instant, till silence was again restored by the sight of Amabel smoothing out the folds of her crisp white frock with an incredulous, almost insulting smile that at once fixed attention again on Fredrick. He seized the occasion and spoke up in a tone of great resolve. "I have made an assertion," said he, "before God and before this jury. To make it seem a credible one, I shall have to tell my own story from the beginning. Am I allowed to do so, Mr. Coroner?" "You are," was the firm response. "Then, gentlemen," continued Fredrick, still without looking at Amabel, whose smile had acquired a mockery that drew the eyes of the jury towards her more than once during the following recital, "you know, and the public generally now know, that Mrs. Webb had left me the greater portion of the money of which she died possessed. I have never before acknowledged to anyone, not even to the good man who awaits the jury's verdict on the other side of that door yonder, that she had reasons for this, good reasons, reasons of which, up to the very evening of her death, I am myself ignorant, as I was ignorant of her intentions in my regard, or that I was the special object of her attention, or that we were under any mutual obligations in any way. Why, then, I should have thought of going to her in the great strait in which I found myself on that day, I cannot say. I knew she had money in her house. This I had unhappily been made acquainted with in an accidental way, and I knew she was one of kindly disposition and quite capable of doing a very unselfish act. Still, this would not seem to be reason enough for me to intrude upon her late at night with the plea for a large loan of money. Had I not been in a desperate condition of mind, which made any attempt seem reasonable that promised relief from the unendurable burden of a pressing and disreputable debt, I was obliged to have money, a great deal of money, and I have to have it at once. And while I know that this will not serve to lighten the suspicion I have brought upon myself by my late admissions, it is the only explanation I can give you for leaving the ball at my father's house, and hurrying down secretly and alone into town to the little cottage where, as I had been told early in the evening, a small entertainment was being given, which would ensure its being open even at so late an hour as midnight. Miss Page, who will, I am sure, pardon the introduction of her name into this narrative, has taken pains to declare to you that in the expedition she herself made into town that evening, she followed some person's step downhill. This is very likely true, and those steps were probably mine, for after leaving the house by the garden door, I came directly down the main road to the corner of the lane, running past Mrs. Webb's cottage. Having already seen from the hillside the light burning in her upper windows, I felt encouraged to proceed, and so hastened on till I came to the gate on High Street. Here I had a moment of hesitation, and thoughts, bitter enough for me to recall them at this moment, came into my mind, making that instant perhaps the worst in my life, but they passed, thank God, and with no more desperate feeling than a sullen intention of having my own way about this money, I lifted the latch of the front door and stepped in. I had expected to find a jovial group of friends in our little ground parlor, or at least to hear the sound of merry voices and laughter in the rooms above, but no sound of any sort awaited me. Indeed, the house seemed strangely silent for one so fully lighted, and astonished at this, I pushed the door ajar at my left and looked in. An unexpected and pitiful sight awaited me. Seated at a table set with abundance of untasted food, I saw the master of the house with his head sunk forward on his arms, asleep. The expected guests had failed to arrive, and he, tired out with waiting, had fallen into a doze at the board. This was a condition of things for which I was not prepared. Mrs. Webb, whom I wished to see, was probably upstairs, and while I might summon her by a sturdy rap on the door beside which I stood, I had so little desire to wake her husband, of whose mental condition I was well aware, that I could not bring myself to make any loud noise within his hearing. Yet I had not the courage to retreat. All my hope of relief from the many difficulties that menaced me lay in the generosity of this great-hearted woman, and if out of pusillanimity I let this hour go without making my appeal, nothing but shame and disaster awaited me. Yet how could I hope to lure her downstairs without noise? I could not. And so, yielding to the impulse of the moment, without any realization, I here swear of the effect which my unexpected presence would have had on the noble woman overheard, I slipped up the narrow staircase, and catching at that moment the sound of her voice calling out to Batsy, I stepped up to the door I saw standing open before me, and confronted her before she could move from the table before which she was sitting, counting over a large roll of money. My look, and it was doubtless not a common look, for the sight of a mass of money at that moment, when money was everything to me, roused every lurking demon in my breast, seemed to appall, if it did not frighten me, for she rose, and meeting my eye with a gaze in which shock and some strange and poignant agony totally incomprehensible to me were strangely blended, she cried out, "No, no, Fredrick, you don't know what you are doing. If you want my money, take it. If you want my life, I will give it to you with my own hand. Don't stain yours. Don't." I did not understand her. I did not know until I thought it over afterward that my hand was thrust convulsively into my breast in a way which, taken with my wild mien, made me look as if I had come to murder her for the money over which she was hovering. I was blind, deaf to everything but that money, and bending madly forward in a state of mental intoxication awful enough for me to remember now, I answered her frenzied words by some such broken exclamations such as these: "Give then! I want hundreds, thousands, now, to save myself. Disgrace, shame, prison await me if I don't have them. Give, give!" And my hand went out toward it, not toward her, but she mistook the action, mistook my purpose, and, with a heart-broken cry to save me from crime, the worst crime of which humanity is capable, she caught up a dagger, lying only too near her hand, in the open drawer against which she leaned, and in a moment of fathomless anguish, which we who can never know more than the outward seeming of her life can hardly measure, plunged against it, and I can tell you no more. Her blood and Batsy's shriek from the adjoining room swam through my consciousness, and then she fell, as I supposed, dead upon the floor, and I, in scarcely better case, fell also. This, as God lives, is the truth concerning the wound found in the breast of this never-to-be-forgotten woman. The feeling, the pathos, The anguish even to be found in his tone made the story, strange and incredible as it is, appear for the moment, plausible. "And Batsy?" asked the coroner. "Must have fallen when we did, for I never heard her voice after the first scream. But I shall speak of her again. What I must now explain is how the money in Mrs. Webb's drawer came into my possession, and how the dagger she had planted in her breast came to be found on the lawn outside. When I came to myself, and that must have been very soon, I found that the blow of which I had been such a horrified witness had not yet proved fatal. The eyes I had seen close, as I had supposed, forever were now open, and she was looking at me with a smile that has never left my memory and never will. "There was no blood on you," she murmured. "You did not strike the blow. Was it only money that you wanted, Fredrick? If so, you could have done it without crime. There are $500 in that table. Take them and let them pave your way to a better life. My death will help you remember. Do these words, this action of hers, seem incredible to you, sirs? Alas, alas, they will not when I tell you." And here he cast one anxious, deeply anxious glance at the room in which Mr. Sutherland was hidden. "That unknown to me, unknown to anyone living but herself, unknown to the good man from whom it can no longer be kept hidden. Agatha Webb was my mother. I am Philemon's son, and not the offspring of Charles and Marietta Sutherland." End of section 31. Recording by Shivansh Dhar. Section 32 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Agatha Webb by Anna Katharine Green. A Witness Lost. Recording by Shivansh Dhar. Impossible! Incredible! Like a wave suddenly lifted, the whole assemblage rose in surprise if not in protest. But there was no outburst. The very depth of feelings evoked made all ebullition impossible, and as one sees the billow pause ere it breaks, and gradually subside, so this crowd yielded to its awe, and man by man sank back into his seat till quiet was again restored, and only a circle of listening faces confronted the man who had just stirred a whole roomful to its depths. Seeing this, and realizing his opportunity, Fredrick at once entered into the explanations for which each heart there panted. This will be overwhelming news to him, who has cared for me since infancy. You have heard him call me son. With what words shall I overthrow his confidence in the truth and rectitude of his long-buried wife, and make him know in his old age that he has wasted years of patience upon one who was not of his blood or lineage? The wonder, the incredulity you manifest are my best excuse for my long delay in revealing the secret entrusted to me by this dying woman. An odd silence greeted these words. Never was the interest of a crowd more intense or his passions held in greater restraint. Yet Agnes's tears flowed freely, and Amabel's smiles, well, their expressions had changed. And to Sweetwater, who alone had eyes for her now, they were surcharged with a tragic meaning, strange to see in one of her callous nature. Frederick's voice broke as he proceeded in his self-imposed task. The astounding fact which I have just communicated to you was made known by my mother. With the dagger still plunged in her breast, she would not let me draw it out. She knew that death would follow that act, and she prized every moment remaining to her, because of the bliss she enjoyed of seeing and having near her only living child. The love, the passion, the boundless devotion she showed me in those last few minutes transformed me in an instant from a selfish brute into a deeply repentant man. I knelt before her in anguish. I made her feel that, wicked as I had been, I was not the conscienceless wretch she imagined me, and she was mistaken as to the motives which led me into her presence. And when I saw by her clearing brow and peaceful look that I had fully persuaded her of this, I let her speak what words she would, and tell, as she was able, the secret tragedy of her life. It is a sacred story to me, and if you must know it, let it be from her own words in the letter she left behind her. She only told me that to save me from the fate of the children who had preceded me, the 5 little girls and boys who had perished almost at birth in her arms. She had parted from me in early infancy to Mrs. Sutherland, then mourning the sudden death of her only child, that this had been done secretly and under circumstances calculated to deceive Mr. Sutherland. Consequently, he had never known I was not his own child, and in the terror of the effect which the truth might have upon him, she enjoined me not to enlighten him now, if by any sacrifice on my part I could rightfully avoid it. That she was happy in having me hear the truth before she died. That the joy which this gave her was so great, she did not regret her fatal act, violent and uncalled for as it was, for it had showed her my heart and allowed me to read hers. Then she talked to my father, by whom I mean whom you call Philemon, and she made me promise I would care for him to the last with tenderness, saying that I would be able to do this without seeming impropriety, since she had willed me all her fortune under this proviso. Finally, she gave me a key, and pointing out where the money lay hidden, bade me carry it away as her last gift, together with the package of letters I would find with it. And when I had taken these and given her back the key, she told me that but for one thing she would die happy. And though her strength and breath were fast failing her, she made me understand that she was worried about the Zabels, who had not come according to a sacred custom between them to celebrate the anniversary of her wedding, and prayed me to see the 2 old gentlemen before I slept, since nothing but death or dire distress would have kept them from gratifying the one whim of my father's failing mind. I promised, and with perfect peace in her face, she pointed to the dagger in her breast. But before I could lay my hand upon it, she called for Batsy. "I want her to hear me declare before I go," said she, "that this stroke was delivered by myself upon myself. But when I rose to look for Batsy, I found that the shock of her mistress's fatal act had killed her, and that only her dead body was lying across the window-sill of the adjoining room. It was a chance that robbed me of the only witness who could testify to my innocence. In case my presence in this house of death should become known, and realizing all danger in which it threw me, I did not dare tell to my mother, for fear it would make her last moments miserable. So I told her that the poor woman had understood what she had wished, but was too terrified to move or speak. And this satisfied my mother, and made her last breath one of trust and contented love. She died as I drew the dagger from her breast, and seeing this I was seized with horror of the instrument which had cost me such dear and valuable life, and flung it widely from the window. Then I lifted her and laid her where you found her, on the sofa. I did not know that the dagger was an old-time gift from her former lover, James Zabel, much less that it bore his initials on the handle. He paused, and the awe occasioned by the scene he had described was so deep, and the silence so prolonged, that a shudder passed over the whole assemblage, when from some unknown quarter a single cutting voice arose in this one short, mocking comment. "Oh, the fairy tale!" Was it Amabel who spoke? Some thought so, and looked her way, but they only beheld a sweet, tear-stained face turned it with an air of moving appeal upon Fredrick, as if begging pardon for the wicked doubts which had driven him to this defence. Fredrick met that look with one so severe it partook of harshness. Then resuming his testimony, he said, "It is one of the Zabel brothers I must now speak, and of how one of them, James by name, came to be involved in this affair. When I left my dead mother's side, I was in such a state of mind that I passed with scarcely so much as a glance the room where my new-found father sat sleeping. But as I hastened on toward the quarter where the Zabels lived, I was seized by such a compunction for his desolate state, that I faltered in my rapid flight, and did not arrive at the place of my destination as quickly as I intended. When I did, I found the house dark, and the silence sepulchral, but I did not turn away, remembering my mother's anxiety, an anxiety so extreme it disturbed her final moments. I approached the front door and was about to knock when I found it open. Greatly astonished, I at once passed in, and seeing my way perfectly in the moonlight, entered the room on the left, the door of which also stood open. It was the second house I had entered unannounced that night, and in this, as in the other, I encountered a man sitting asleep by the table. It was John, the elder of the two, and perceiving that he was suffering for food and in a condition of extreme misery, I took out the first bill my hand encountered in my overfull pockets and laid it on the table by his side. As I did so, he gave a sigh, but did not wake, and satisfied I had done all that was wise, and all that even my mother would expect of me under the circumstances, and fearing to encounter the elder brother if I lingered, I hastened away and took the shortest path home. Had I been more of a man, or if my visit to Mrs. Webb had been actuated by a more communicable motive, I would have gone at once to the good man who believed me to be of his own flesh and blood, and told him of the strange and heart-rending adventure which had changed the whole tenor of my thoughts in life, and begged his advice as to what I had better to do under the difficult circumstances in which I found myself placed. But the memory of 1,000 past ingratitudes, together with the knowledge of the shock which he could not fail to receive on learning at this late day, and under circumstances at once so tragic and full of menace, that the child which his long-buried wife had once placed in his arms as his own was neither of her blood nor his, rose up between us and caused me not only to attempt silence, but to secrete in the adjoining woods the money I had received, in the vain hope that all visible connections between myself and my mother's tragic death would thus be lost. You see, I had not calculated on Miss Amabel Page. The flash she here received from the lady's eyes startled the crowd, and gave Sweetwater, already suffering under shock after shock of mingled surprise and wonder, his first definite idea. He had never rightly understood the relations between the two, and that something besides justice had actuated Amabel in her treatment of this young man. This feeling was shared by others, and a reaction set in Fredrick's favor, which even affected the officials who were conducting the inquiry. This was shown by the difference of manner now assumed by the coroner, and by the more easily impressed Sweetwater, who had not yet learned the indispensable art of hiding his feelings. Fredrick himself felt the change, and showed it by the look of relief and growing confidence he cast at Agnes. Of the questions and answers which now passed between him and the various members of the jury, I need give no account. They but emphasized facts already known, and produced but little change in the general feeling, which is now one of suppressed pity for all those who had been drawn into the meshes of this tragic mystery. When he was allowed to resume his seat, the name of Miss Amabel Page was called again. She rose with a bound. Not that she had anticipated had occurred. Facts of which she could know nothing had changed the aspect of affairs and made the position of Fredrick something so remote from any she could have imagined, that she was still in the maze of the numberless conflicting emotions which these revelations were calculated to call out in one who had risked all on the hazard of a dying lost. She did not even know at this moment whether she was glad or sorry he could explain so cleverly his anomalous position. She had caught the look he had cast at Agnes, and while this angered her, it did not greatly modify her opinion that he was destined for herself. For however other people might feel, she did not for a moment believe his story. She had not a pure enough heart to do so. To her, all self-sacrifice was an anomaly. No woman of the mental or physical strength of Agatha Webb would plant a dagger in her own breast just to prevent another person from committing a crime, were he lover, husband, or son. So Amabel believed, and so would these others believe, also when once relieved of the magnetic personality of this extraordinary witness. Yet how thrilling it had been to hear him plead his cause so well! It was almost worth the loss of her revenge to meet his look of hate, and dream of the possibility of turning it later into the old look of love. Yes, she loved him now, not for his position, for that he was gone. Not even for his money, for she could contemplate his loss, but for himself, who had so boldly shown that he was stronger than she, and could triumph over her by the sheer force of his masculine daring. With such feelings, what would she say to these men? How conduct herself under questions which would be much more searching now than before? She could not even decide in her own mind. She must let impulse have its way. Happily, she took the right stand at first. She did not endeavor to make any corrections in her former testimony, only acknowledging that the flower whose presence on the scene of death had been such a mystery had fallen from her hair at the ball, and that she had seen Fredrick pick it up and put it in his buttonhole. Beyond this, the inferences it afterward awakened in her mind, she would not go, though many present, and among them Fredrick, felt confident that her attitude had been one of suspicion from the first, and that it was to follow him rather than to supply the wants of the old man, Zabel. She had left the ball, and found her way to Agatha Webb's cottage. End of section 32. Recording by Shivansh Dhar.
Section 33 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Part 1 of Why Agatha Webb Will Never Be Forgotten in Sutherlandtown. Meanwhile, Sweetwater had been witness to a series of pantomimic actions that interested him more than Amabel's conduct under this final examination. Fredrick, who had evidently some request to make or direction to give, had sent a written line to the coroner, who, on reading it, had passed it over to Knapp, who, a few minutes later, was to be seen in conference with Agnes Halliday. As a result, the latter rose and left the room, followed by the detective. She was gone a half an hour. Then, simultaneously with her reappearance, Sweetwater saw Knapp hand a bundle of letters to the coroner, who, upon opening them, chose out several which he proceeded to read to the jury. They were the letters referred to by Fredrick as having been given to him by his mother. The first was dated 35 years previously and was in the handwriting of Agatha herself. It was directed to James Zabel and was read amid a profound hush. Dear James, you are too presumptuous. When I let you carry me away from John in that maddening reel last night, I did not mean you to draw the inference you did. That you did draw it argues a touch of vanity in a man who is not alone in the field where he imagines himself victor. John, who is humbler, sees some merit in Frederick Snow, let us say. So do I, but merit does not always win any more than presumption. When we meet, let it be as friends, but as friends only. A girl cannot be driven into love. To ride on your big mare, Judith, is bliss enough for my 20 years. Why don't you find it so too? I think I hear you say you do, but only when she stops at a certain gate on Portchester Highway. Folly! There are other roads and other gates, though if I should see you enter one, there! My pen is galloping away with me faster than Judith ever did, and it is time I drew rein. Present my regards to John, but no, then he would know I had written you a letter, and that might hurt him. How could he guess if it was only a scolding letter, such as it would grieve him to receive, and that it does not count for anything? Were it to Frederick Snow, now, there, some horses are so hard to pull up, and so are some pens. I will come to a standstill, but not before your door. Respectfully, your neighbor, Agatha Gilchrist. Dear James, I know I have a temper, a wicked temper, and now you know it too. When it is roused, I forget love, gratitude, and everything else that should restrain me, and utter words I am myself astonished at. But I do not get roused often, and when all is over I am not averse to apologizing or even to begging forgiveness. My father says my temper will undo me, but I am much more afraid of my heart than I am of my temper. For instance, here I am writing to you again just because I raised my riding whip and said, but you know what I said, and I am not fond of recalling the words, for I cannot do so without seeing your look of surprise and contrasting it with that of Philemon's. Yours had judgment in it, while Philemon's held only indulgence. Yet I liked yours best, or should have liked it best if it were not for the insufferable pride which is a part of my being. Temper such as mine ought to surprise you. Yet would I be Agatha Gilchrist without it? I very much fear not. And not being Agatha Gilchrist, should I have your love? Again, I fear not. James, forgive me. When I am happier, when I know my own heart, I will have less provocation. Then, if that heart turns your way, you will find a great and bountiful serenity where now there are lowering and thunderous tempests. Philemon said last night that he would be content to have my fierce word of mornings, if only I would give him one drop out of the honey of my better nature when the sun went down at twilight, brought reflection and love. But I did not like him any better for saying this. You would not have the day so. The cup with which you would refresh yourself must hold no bitterness. Will it not have to be proffered then by other hands than those of Agatha Gilchrist? Mr. Philemon Webb. Respected Sir, you are persistent. I am willing to tell you, though I shall never confide so much to another, that it will take a stronger nature than yours, and one that loves me less, to hold me faithful and make me the happy, devoted wife which I must be if I would not be a demon. I cannot, I dare not, marry where I am not held in a passionate, self-forgetful subjection. I am too proud, too sensitive, too little mistress of myself when angry or aroused. If, like some strong women, I loved what was weaker than myself, I could be controlled by goodness and unlimited kindness. I might venture to risk living at the side of the most indulgent and upright man I know. But I am not of that kind. Strength only can command my admiration or subdue my pride. I must fear where I love, and own for husband him who has first shown himself my master. So do not fret any more for me, for you, less than any man I know, will ever claim my obedience or command my love. Not that I will not yield my heart to you, but that I cannot, and, knowing that I cannot, feel it honest to say so before any more of your fine young manhood is wasted. Go your ways, then, Philemon, and leave me to the rougher paths my feet were made to tread. I like you now, and feel something like a tender regard for your goodness, but if you persist in a courtship which only my father is inclined to smile upon, you will call up an antagonism that can lead to nothing but evil. For the serpent that lies coiled in my breast has deadly fangs, and is to be feared, as you should know who have more than once seen me angry. Do not blame John or James Zabel or Frederick Snow or even Samuel Barton for this. It would be the same if none of these men existed. I was not made to triumph over a kindly nature, but to yield the haughtiest heart in all this county to the gentle but firm control of its natural master. Do you want to know who that master is? I cannot tell you, for I have not yet named him to myself. Dear James, I am going away. I am going to leave Portchester for several months. I am going to see the world. I did not tell you this last night for fear of weakening under your entreaties, or should I say commands? Lately I have felt myself weakening more than once, and I want to know what it means. Absence will teach me. Absence and the sight of new faces. Do you quarrel with this necessity? Do you think I should know my mind without any such test? Alas, James, it is not a simple mind, and it baffles me at times. Let us then give it a chance. If the glow and glamour of elegant city life can make me forget certain snatches of talk at our old gate, or that night when you drew my hand through your arm and softly kissed my fingertips, then I am no mate for you, whose love, however critical, has never wavered, but has made itself felt, even in rebuke, as the strongest, sweetest thing that has entered my turbulent life. Because I would be worthy of you, I submit to a separation which will either be a permanent one, or the last that will ever take place between you and me. John will not bear this as well as you, yet he does not love me as well, possibly because to him I am simply a superior being, while to you I am a loving but imperfect woman who wishes to do right, but can only do so under the highest guidance. Dear John, I feel that I owe you a letter because you have been so patient. You may show it to James if you like, but I mean it for you, as an old and dear friend who will one day dance at my wedding. I am living in a whirl of enjoyment. I am seeing and tasting of pleasures I have only dreamed about till now. From a farmhouse kitchen to Mrs. Andrews' drawing room is a lively change for a girl who loves dress and show only less than daily intercourse with famous men and brilliant women. But I am bearing it nobly and have developed tastes I did not know I possessed. Expensive tastes, John, which I fear may unfit me for the humble life of a Portchester matron. Can you imagine me dressed in rich brocade, sitting in the midst of Washington's choicest citizens, and exchanging sallies with senators and judges? You may find it hard, yet so it is, and no one seems to think I am out of place, nor do I feel so. Only do not tell James. There are movements in my heart at times which make me shut my eyes when the lights are brightest, and dream, if but for an instant, of home and the tumble-down gateway where I have so often leaned when someone, you know who it is now, John, and I shall not hurt you too deeply by mentioning him, was saying good night and calling down the blessings of heaven upon a head not worthy to receive them. Does this argue my speedy return? Perhaps, yet I do not know. There are fond hearts here also, and a life in this country's centre would be a great life for me if only I could forget the touch of a certain restraining hand which has great power over me even as a memory. For the sake of that touch, shall I give up the grandeur and charm of this broad life? Answer, John. You know him and me well enough now to say. Dear John, I do not understand your letter. You speak in affectionate terms of everybody, yet you beg me to wait and not to be in a hurry to return. Why? Do you not realize that such words only make me more anxious to see old Portchester again? If there is anything amiss at home, or if James is learning to do without me, but you do not say that, you only intimate that perhaps I will be better able to make up my mind later than now, and hint of great things to come if I will only hold my affections in check a little longer. This is all very ambiguous and demands a fuller explanation, so write to me once more, John, or I shall sever every engagement I have made here and return. Dear John, your letter is plain enough this time. James read the letter I wrote you about my pleasure in the life here, and was displeased at it. He thinks I am growing worldly and losing that simplicity which he has always looked upon as my most attractive characteristic. So, well, James is right. I am becoming less the country girl and more the woman of the world. Every day I remain here. That means I am becoming less worthy of him. So, but whatever else I have to say on this topic must be said to him. For this you will pardon me like the good brother you are. I cannot help my preference. He is nearer my own age. Besides, we were made for each other. Dear James, I am not worldly. I am not carried away by the pleasures and satisfactions of this place, at least not to the point of forgetting what is dearer and better. I have seen Washington. I have seen gay life. I like it, but I love Portchester. Consequently, I am going to return to Portchester, and that very soon. Indeed, I cannot stay away much longer, and if you are glad of this, and if you wish to be convinced that a girl who has been wearing brocade and jewels can content herself quite gaily again with calico, come up to the dear old gate a week from now, and you will have the opportunity. Do you object to flowers? I may wear a flower in my hair. Your wayward but ever constant Agatha. Dear James, why must I write? Why am I not content with the memory of last night? When one's cup is quite full, a cup that has been so long in filling, must some few drops escape just to show that a great joy like mine is not satisfied to be simply quiescent? I have suffered so long from uncertainty, have tried you and tried myself with so tedious an indecision, that now I know no other man can ever move my heart as you have done. The ecstasy of it makes me over demonstrative. I want to tell you that I love you, that I do not simply accept your love, but give you back in fullest measure all the devotion you have heaped upon me in spite of my many faults and failings. You took me to your heart last night and seemed satisfied, but it does not satisfy me that I just let you do it without telling you that I am proud and happy to be the chosen one of your heart, and that as I saw your smile and the proud passion which lit up your face, I felt how much sweeter was the dear domestic bliss you promised me than the more brilliant but colder life of a statesman's wife in Washington. I missed the flower from my hair when I went back to my room last night. Did you take it, dear? If so, do not cherish it. I hate to think of anything withering on your breast. My love is deathless, James, and owns no such symbol as that. But perhaps you are not thinking of my love, but of my faults. If so, let the flower remain where you have put it, and when you gaze on it, say, "Thus it is with the defects of my darling, once in full bloom, now a withered remembrance. When I gathered her, they began to fade. Oh, James, I feel as if I never could feel anger again. Dear James, I cannot believe it. Though you said to me on going out, your father will explain. I cannot content myself with his explanations, and will never believe what he said of you except you confirm his accusations by your own act. If, after I have told you exactly what passed between us, you return me these and other letters, then I shall know that I have leaned my weight on a hollow staff, and that henceforth I am to be without protector or comforter in this world. Oh, James, were we not happy? I believed in you and felt that you believed in me. When we stood heart to heart under the elm tree, was it only last night? And you swore that if it lay in the power of earthly man to make me happy, I should taste every sweet that a woman's heart naturally craved. I thought my heaven had already come, and that now it only remained for me to create yours. Yet that very minute my father was approaching us, and in another instant we heard these words: James, I must talk with you before you make my daughter forget herself any further. Forget herself! What happened? This was not the way my father had been accustomed to talk, much as he had always favored the suit of Philemon Webb, and pleased as he would have been had my choice fallen on him. Forget herself! I looked at you to see how these insulting words would affect you, but while you turned pale, or seemed to do so in the fading moonlight, you were not quite so unprepared for them as I was myself, and instead of showing anger, followed my father into the house, leaving me shivering in a spot which had held no chill for me a moment before. You were gone. How long? To me it seemed an hour, and perhaps it was. It would seem to take that long for a man's face to show such change as yours did when you confronted me again in the moonlight. Yet a lightning stroke makes quick work, and perhaps my countenance in that one minute showed as great a change as yours. Else why did you shudder away from me, and to my passionate appeal reply with this one short phrase: Your father will explain? Did you think any other words than yours would satisfy me, or that I could believe even him when he accused you of a base and dishonest act? Much as I have always loved and revered my father, I find it impossible not to hope that in his wish to see me united to Philemon, he has resorted to an unworthy subterfuge to separate us. Therefore, I give you our interview, word for word. May it shock you as much as it shocked me. Here is what he said first: Agatha, you cannot marry James Zabel. He is not an honest man. He has defrauded me, your father, of several $1,000, in a clever way, too, showing him to be as subtle as he is unprincipled. Shall I tell you the wretched story, my girl? He has left me to do so. He sees as plainly as I do that any communication between you two, after the discovery I have this day made, would be but an added offense. He is at least a gentleman, which is something, considering how near he came to being my son-in-law. I may have answered. People do cry out when they are stabbed, sometimes, but I rather think I did not say a word, only looked a disdain, which at that minute was as measureless as my belief in you. You dishonest? You? Or perhaps I laughed. That would have been truer to my feeling. Yes, I must have laughed. My father's next words indicated that I did something. You do not believe in his guilt," he went on, and there was a kindness in his tone which gave me my first feeling of real terror. "I can readily comprehend that, Agatha. He has been in my office and acted under my eye for several years now, and I had almost as much confidence in him as you had, notwithstanding the fact that I liked him much better as my confidential clerk than as your probable or prospective husband. He has never held the key to my heart. Good God, he never had to yours. But he was a good and reliable man in the office, or so I thought, and I gave into his hand much of the work I ought to have done myself, especially since my health has more or less failed me. My trust he abused. A month ago, it was during that ill turn you remember, I received a letter from a man I had never expected to hear from again. He was in my debt some $10,000, and wrote that he had brought with him as much of this sum as he had been able to save in the last 5 years to Sutherlandtown, where he was now laid up with a dangerous illness from which he had small hope of recovering. Would I come there and get it? He was a stranger and wished to take no one into his confidence, but he had the money and would be glad to place it in my hands. He added that as he was a lone man without friends or relatives to inherit from him, he felt a decided pleasure at the prospect of satisfying his only creditor, and devoutly hoped he would be well enough to realize the transaction and receive my receipt. But if his fever increased and he should be delirious or unconscious when I reached him, then I was to lift up the left-hand corner of the mattress on which he lay and take from underneath his head a black wallet in which I could find the money promised me. He had elsewhere enough to pay all his expenses, so that the full contents of the wallet were mine. I remembered the man, and I wanted the money, so, not being able to go for it myself, I authorized James Zabel to collect it for me. He started at once for Sutherlandtown, and in a few hours returned with the wallet alluded to. Though I was suffering intensely at the time, I remember distinctly the air with which he laid it down and the words with which he endeavored to carry off a certain secret excitement visible in him. "Mr. Orr was alive, sir, and fully conscious, but he will not outlive the night. He seemed quite satisfied with the messenger and gave up the wallet without any hesitation." I roused up and looked at him. "What has shaken you up so?" I asked. He was silent a moment before replying. "I have ridden fast," said he, then more slowly. "One feels sorry for a man dying alone and amongst strangers. I thought he showed an unnecessary emotion, but paid no further heed to it at the time." The wallet held $2,000 and more, which was less than I expected, but yet a goodly sum and very welcome. As I was counting it over, I glanced at the paper accompanying it. It was an acknowledgment of debt and mentioned the exact sum I should find in the wallet, $2,753.67. Pointing them out to James, I remarked, "The figures are in different ink from the words. How do you account for that?" I thought his answer rather long in coming, though when it did come it was calm, if not studied. "I presume," he said, "that the sum was inserted at Sutherlandtown after Mr. Orr was quite sure just how much he could spare for the liquidation of this old debt." "Very likely," I assented, not bestowing another thought upon the matter. But today it has been forced back upon my attention in a curious if not providential way. I was over in Sutherlandtown for the first time since my illness, and having some curiosity about my unfortunate but honest debtor, I went to the hotel and asked to see the room in which he died. It being empty, they at once showed it to me, and satisfied that he had been made comfortable in his last hours. I was turning away when I espied on a table in one corner an inkstand and what seemed to be an old copy book. Why I stopped and approached this table I do not know, but once in front of it I remembered what Zabel had said about the figures, and taking up the pen I saw there, I dipped it in the ink pot and attempted to scribble a number or two on a piece of loose paper I found in the copy book. The ink was thick and the pen corroded, so that it was not till after several ineffectual efforts that I succeeded in making any strokes that were at all legible. But when I did, they were so exact similar in color to the numbers inserted in Mr. Orr's memorandum, which I had fortunately brought with me, that I was instantly satisfied this special portion of the writing had been done, as James had said, in this room, and with the very pen I was then handling. As there was nothing extraordinary in this, I was turning away, when a gust of wind from the open window lifted the loose sheet of paper I had been scribbling on and landed it, the other side up, on the carpet. As I stooped for it, I saw figures on it, and feeling sure that they had been scrawled there by Mr. Orr in his attempt to make the pen write, I pulled out the memorandum again and compared the two minutely. They were the work of the same hand, but the figures on the stray leaf differed from those in the memorandum in a very important particular. Those in the memorandum began with a 2, while those on the stray sheet began with a 7. A striking difference. Look, Agatha, here is the piece of paper just as I found it. You see here, there, and everywhere the one set of figures, 7,753.67. Here it is hardly legible. Here it is blotted with too much ink. Here it is faint but sufficiently distinct. And here, well, there can be no mistake about these figures. 7,753.67. Yet the memorandum reads 2,753.67, and the money returned to me amounts to 2,753.67, a clean $5,000 difference. Here, James, my father paused, perhaps to give me a commiserating look, though I did not need it, perhaps to give himself a moment in which to regain courage for what he still had to say. I did not break the silence. I was too sure of your integrity. Besides, my tongue could not have moved if it would. All my faculties seemed frozen except that instinct which cried out continually within me, no, there is no fault in James. He has done no wrong. No one but himself shall ever convince me that he has robbed anyone of anything except poor me of my poor heart. But inner cries of this kind are inaudible, and after a moment's interval my father went on. $5,000 is no petty sum, and the discrepancy in the two sets of figures which seemed to involve me in so considerable a loss set me thinking. Convinced that Mr. Orr would not be likely to scribble one number over so many times, if it was not the one then in his mind, I went to Mr. Forsyth's office and borrowed a magnifying glass. through which I again subjected the figures in the memorandum to a rigid scrutiny. The result was a positive conviction that they had been tampered with after their first writing, either by Mr. Orr himself or by another whom I need not name. The 2 had originally been a 7, and I could even see where the top line of the 7 had been given a curl and where a horizontal stroke had been added to the bottom. Agatha, I came home as troubled a man as there was in all these parts. I remembered the suppressed excitement which had been in James Zabel's face when he handed me over the money, and I remembered also that you loved him, or thought you did, and that, love or not love, you were pledged to marry him. If I had not recalled all this, I might have proceeded more warily. As it was, I took the bold and open course and gave James Zabel an opportunity to explain himself. Agatha, he did not embrace it. He listened to my accusations and followed my finger when I pointed out the discrepancy between the 2 sets of figures, but he made no protestations of innocence, nor did he show me the front of an honest man when I asked if he expected me to believe that the wallet had held only 2,000 and over when Mr. Orr handed it over to him. On the contrary, he seemed to shrink into himself like a person whose life has been suddenly blasted, and replying that he would expect me to believe nothing except his extreme contrition at the abuse of confidence of which he had been guilty, begged me to wait till tomorrow before taking any active steps in the matter. I replied that I would show him that much consideration if he would immediately drop all pretensions to your hand. This put him on a bad way, but he left, as you see, with such a simple injunction to you to seek from me an explanation of his strange departure. Does that look like innocence, or does it look like guilt?" I found my tongue at this and passionately cried, "James Zabel's life, as I have known it, shows him to be an honest man. If he has done what you suggest, given you but a portion of the money entrusted to him, and altered the figures in the memorandum to suit the amount he brought you, then there is a discrepancy between this act and all the other acts of his life which I find it more difficult to reconcile than you did the 2 sets of figures in Mr. Orr's handwriting. Father, I must hear from his own lips a confirmation of your suspicions before I will credit them. And this is why I write to you so minute an account of what passed between my father and myself last night. If his account of the matter is a correct one, and you have nothing to add to it in way of explanation, then the return of this letter will be token enough that my father has been just in his accusations, and that the bond between us must be broken. But if, oh James, if you are the true man I consider you, and all that I have heard is a fabrication or mistake, then come to me at once. Do not delay, but come at once, and the sight of your face at the gate will be enough to establish your innocence in my eyes. Agatha. End of Part 1 of Why Agatha Webb Will Never Be Forgotten in Sutherlandtown. Recorded by Gabby Cowan. Section 34 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Part 2 of Why Agatha Webb Will Never Be Forgotten in Sutherlandtown. The letter that followed this was very short. Dear James, the package of letters has been received. God help me to bear this shock to all my hopes and the death of all my girlish beliefs. I am not angry. Only those who have something left to hold on to in life can be angry. My father tells me he has received a packet too. It contained $5,000 in 10 $500 notes. James, James, was not my love enough that you should want my father's money too? I have begged my father, and he has promised me to keep the cause of this rupture secret. No one shall know from either of us that James Zabel has any flaw in his nature. The next letter was dated some months later. It is to Philemon. Dear Philemon, the gloves are too small. Besides, I never wear gloves. I hate their restraint and do not feel there is any good reason for hiding my hands in this little country town where everyone knows me. Why not give them to Hattie Weller? She likes such things, while I have had my fill of finery. A girl whose one duty is to care for a dying father has no room left in her heart for vanities. Dear Philemon, it is impossible. I have had my day of love, and my heart is quite dead. Show your magnanimity by ceasing to urge me any longer to forget the past. It is all you can do for Agatha. Dear Philemon, you will have my hand, though I have told you that my heart doesn't go with it. It is hard to understand such persistence, but if you are satisfied to take a woman of my strength against her will, then God have mercy upon you, for I will be your wife. But do not ask me to go to Sutherlandtown. I will live here, and do not expect to keep up your intimacy with the Zabels. There is no tie of affection remaining between James and myself, but if I am to shed that half light over your home, which is all I can promise and all that you can hope to receive, then keep me from all influence but your own. That this in time may grow sweet and dear to me is my earnest prayer today, for you are worthy of a true wife. Agatha. Dear John, I am going to be married. My father exacts it, and there is no good reason why I should not give him this final satisfaction. At least, I do not think there is. But if you or your brother differ from me, say good-bye to James from me. I pray that his life may be peaceful. I know that it will be honest. Agatha. Dear Philemon, my father is worse. He fears that if we wait till Tuesday, he will not be able to see us married. Decide, then, what our duty is. I am ready to abide by your pleasure. Agatha. The following is from John Zabel to his brother James, and is dated one day after the above. Dear James, when you read this, I will be far away, never to look in your face again, unless you bid me. Brother, I meant it for the best, but God was not with me, and I have made 4 hearts miserable without giving help to anyone. When I read Agatha's letter, the last for more reasons than one that I shall ever receive from her, I seemed to feel as never before what I had done to blast your 2 lives. For the first time I realized to the full that but for me she might have been happy, and you the respected husband of the one grand woman to be found in Portchester. That I had loved her so fiercely myself came back to me in reproach, and the thought that she perhaps suspected that the blame had fallen where it was not deserved roused me to such a pitch that I took the sudden and desperate resolution of telling her the truth before she gave her hand to Philemon. Why the daily sight of your misery should not have driven me before to this act, I cannot tell. Some remnants of the old jealousy may have been still festering in my heart, or the sense of the great distance between your self-sacrificing spirit and the selfishness of my weaker nature risen like a barrier between me and the only noble act left for a man in my position. Whatever the cause, it was not till today the full determination came to brave the obloquy of a full confession. But when it did come, I did not pause till I reached Mr. Gilchrist's house and was ushered into his presence. He was lying on the sitting-room lounge, looking very weak and exhausted, while on one side of him stood Agatha and on the other Philemon, both contemplating him with ill-concealed anxiety. I had not expected to find Philemon there, and for a moment I suffered the extreme agony of a man who has not measured the depth of the plunge he is about to take. But the sight of Agatha trembling under the shock of my unexpected presence restored me to myself and gave me firmness to proceed. Advancing with a bow, I spoke quickly the one word I had come there to say. Agatha, I have done you a great wrong, and I am here to undo it. For months I have felt driven to confession, but not till today have I possessed the necessary courage. Now, nothing shall hinder me. I said this because I saw in both Mr. Gilchrist and Philemon a disposition to stop me where I was. Indeed, Mr. Gilchrist had risen on his elbow, and Philemon was making that pleading gesture of his which we know so well. Agatha alone looked eager. "What is it?" she cried. "I have a right to know." I went to the door, shut it, and stood with my back against it, a figure of shame and despair. Suddenly the confession burst from me. "Agatha," said I, "why did you break with my brother James? Because you thought him guilty of theft, because you believed he took the $5,000 out of the sum entrusted to him by Mr. Orr for your father. Agatha, it was not James who did this, it was I, and James knew it, and bore the blame of my misdoing, because he was always a loyal soul, and took account of my weakness, and knew, alas, too well, that open shame would kill me." It was a weak plea and merited no reply, but the silence was so dreadful and lasted so long that I felt first crushed and then terrified. Raising my head, for I had not dared to look any of them in the face, I cast one glance at the group before me and dropped my head again, startled. Only one of the three was looking at me, and that was Agatha. The others had their heads turned aside, and I thought, or rather the passing fancy took me, that they shrank from meeting her gaze with something of the same shame and dread I myself felt. But she, can I ever hope to make you realize her look, or comprehend the pang of utter self-abasement with which I succumbed before it? It was so terrible that I seemed to hear her utter words, though I am sure she did not speak, and with some wild idea of stemming the torrent of her reproaches, I made the effort at explanation, and impetuously cried, "It was not for my own good, Agatha, not for self altogether. I did this. I too loved you, madly, despairingly, and, good brother as I seemed, I was jealous of James, and hoped to take his place in your regard if I could show a greater prosperity, and get for you those things his limited prospects denied him. You enjoyed money, beauty, ease. I could see that, by your letters, and if James could not give them to you, and I could, oh, do not look at me like that. I see now that millions could not have bought you." "Despicable!" was all that came from her lips, at which I shuddered and groped about for the handle of the door, but she would not let me go, subduing with an unexpected grand self-restraint the emotions which had hitherto swelled too high in her breast for either speech or action. She thrust out one arm to stay me and said in short, commanding tones: "How was this thing done? You say you took the money, yet it was James who was sent to collect it, or so my father says." Here she tore her looks from me and cast one glance at her father. What she saw I cannot say, but her manner changed, and henceforth she glanced his way as much as mine, and with nearly as much emotion. "I am waiting to hear what you have to say," she exclaimed, laying her hand on the door over my head, so as to leave me no opportunity for escape. I bowed and attempted an explanation. "Agatha," said I, "the commission was given to James, and he rode to Sutherlandtown to perform it. But it was on the day when he was accustomed to write to you, and he was not easy in his mind, for he feared he would miss sending you his usual letter. When, therefore, he came to the hotel and saw me in Philemon's room, I was often there in those days, often without Philemon's knowing it, he saw, or thought he did, a way out of his difficulties. Entering where I was, he explained to me his errand, and we being then, though never, alas, since, one in everything but the secret hopes he enjoyed, he asked me if I would go in his stead to Mr. Orr's room, present my credentials, and obtain the money while he wrote the letter with which his mind was full. Though my jealousy was aroused and I hated the letter he was about to write, I did not see how I could refuse him. So after receiving such credentials as he himself carried, and getting full instructions how to proceed, I left him writing at Philemon's table and hastened down the hall to the door he had pointed out. If Providence had been on the side of guilt, the circumstances could not have been more favorable for the deception I afterwards played. No one was in the hall, no one was with Mr. Orr to note that it was I instead of James who executed Mr. Gilchrist's commission. But I was thinking of no deception then. I proceeded quite innocently on my errand, and when the feeble voice of the invalid bade me enter, I experienced nothing but a feeling of compassion for a man dying in this desolate way, alone. Of course Mr. Orr was surprised to see a stranger, but after reading Mr. Gilchrist's letter, which I handed him, he seemed quite satisfied, and himself drew out the wallet at the head of his bed and handed it over. "You will find," said he, "a memorandum inside of the full amount, 7,758.67. I should like to have returned Mr. Gilchrist the full 10,000 which I owe him, but this is all I possess, barring $100 which I have kept for my final expenses. Mr. Gilchrist will be satisfied," I assured him. "Shall I make you out a receipt?" He shook his head with a sad smile. "I shall be dead in 24 hours. What good will a receipt do me?" But it seemed unbusinesslike not to give it, so I went over to the table where I saw a pen and paper, and recognizing the necessity of counting the money before writing a receipt, I ran my eye over the bills, which were large, and found the wallet contained just the amount he had named. Then I glanced at the memorandum. It had evidently been made out by him at some previous time, for the body of the writing was in firm characters and the ink blue, while the figures were faintly inscribed in muddy black. The 7 especially was little more than a straight line, and as I looked at it, the devil that is in every man's nature whispered at first carelessly, then with deeper and deeper insistence. How easy it would be to change that 7 to a 2. Only a little mark at the top and the least additional stroke at the bottom, and these figures would stand for 5,000 less. It might be a temptation to some men. It presently became a temptation to me, for glancing furtively up, I discovered that Mr. Orr had fallen either into a sleep or into a condition of insensibility which made him oblivious to my movements. $5,000! Just the sum of the 10 $500 bills that made the bulk of the amount I had counted. In this village, and at my age, this sum would raise me at once to comparative independence. The temptation was too strong for resistance. I succumbed to it, and seizing the pen before me, I made the fatal marks. When I went back to James, the wallet was in my hand, and the 10 $500 bills in my breast pocket. Agatha had begun to shudder. She shook so she rattled the door against which I leaned. And when you found that Providence was not so much upon your side as you thought, when you saw that the fraud was known and that your brother was suspected of it— "Don't," I pleaded, "don't make me recall that hour." But she was inexorable. "Recall that and every hour," she commanded. "Tell me why he sacrificed himself, why he sacrificed me, to a cur—" She feared her own tongue. She feared her own anger, and stopped. "Speak," she whispered, and it was the most ghastly whisper that ever left mortal lips. I was but a foot from her, and she held me as by a strong enchantment. I could not help obeying her. "To make it all clear," I pursued, "I must go back to the time I rejoined James in Philemon's room. He had finished his letter when I entered and was standing with it sealed in his hand. I may have cast it a disdainful glance. I may have shown that I was no longer the same man I had been when I left him a half hour before, for he looked curiously at me for a moment previous to saying, 'Is that the wallet you have there? Was Mr. Orr conscious, and did he give it to you himself?' 'Mr. Orr was conscious,' I returned, and I didn't like the sound of my voice, careful as I was to speak naturally. 'But he fainted just before I came out, and I think you had better ask the clerk as you go down to send someone up to him.' James was weighing the pocketbook in his hand. 'How much do you think there is in here?' The debt was 10,000. I had turned carelessly away and was looking out of the window. 'The memorandum inside gives the figures as 2,000, I declared. 'He apologizes for not sending the full amount. He hasn't it.' Again I felt James looking at me. Why? Could he see that guilty wad of bills lying on my breast? 'How came you read the memorandum?' he asked. 'Mr. Orr wished me to. I looked at it to please him.' This was a lie, the first I had ever uttered. James's eyes had not moved. 'John,' said he, 'this little bit of business seems to have disturbed you. I ought to have attended to it myself. I am quite sure I ought to have attended to it myself. "The man is dying," I muttered. "You escaped a sad sight. Be satisfied that you have got the money. Shall I post that letter for you?" He put it jealously in his pocket, and again I saw him look at me, but he said nothing more except that he repeated that same phrase. I ought to have attended to it myself. Agatha might better have waited. Then he went out, but I remained till Philemon came home. My brother and myself were no longer companions. A crime divided us, a crime he could not suspect yet, which made itself felt in both our hearts, and prepared him for the revelation made to him by Mr. Gilchrist some weeks after. That night he came to Sutherlandtown, where I was, and entered my bedroom, not in the fraternal way of the old days, but as an elder enters the presence of a younger. "John," he said without any preamble or preparation, "where are the $5,000 you kept back from Mr. Gilchrist? The memorandum said 7, and you delivered to me only 2. There are death knells sounded in every life. Those words sounded mine, or would have if he had not immediately added, 'There, I knew you had no stamina. I have taken your crime on myself. Who am I really to blame for it, since I delegated my duty to another? And you will only have to bear the disgrace of having James Zabel for a brother. In exchange, give me the money. It shall be returned tomorrow. You cannot have disposed of it already, after which you, or rather I, will be in the eyes of the world only a thief in intent, not in fact.' Had he only stopped there! But he went on, 'Agatha is lost to me, John. In return, be to me the brother I always thought you up to the unhappy day the sin of Achan came between us.' You were lost to him. It was all I heard. You were lost to him. Then, if I acknowledged the crime, I should not only take up my own burden of disgrace, but see him restored to his rights over the only woman I had ever loved. The sacrifice was great, and my virtue was not equal to it. I gave him back the money, but I did not offer to assume the responsibility of my own crime. And since," in what a hard tone she spoke, "I have had to see Philemon gradually assume the rights James once enjoyed." "John," she asked. She was under violent self-restraint. "Why do you come now?" I cast my eyes at Philemon. He was standing as before, with his eyes turned away. There was discouragement in his attitude, mingled with a certain grand patience, seeing that he was better able to bear her loss than either you or myself. I said to her very low, "I thought you ought to know the truth before you gave your final word. I am late, but I would have been too late a week from now." Her hand fell from the door, but her eyes remained fixed on my face. Never have I sustained such a look. Never will I encounter such another. "It is too late now," she murmured. "The clergyman has just gone who united me to Philemon." The next minute her back was towards me. She had faced her father and her new-made husband. "Father, you knew this thing." Keen, sharp, incisive, the words rang out. "I saw it in your face when he began to speak." Mr. Gilchrist drooped slightly. He was a very sick man, and the scene had been a trying one. "If I did," was his low response, "it was but lately. You were engaged then to Philemon. Why break up this second match?" She eyed him as if she found it difficult to credit her ears. Such indifference to the claims of innocence was incredible to her. I saw her grand profile quiver, then the slow ebbing from her cheek of every drop of blood indignation had summoned there. "And you, Philemon?" she suggested, with a somewhat softened aspect. "You committed this wrong ignorantly, never having heard of this crime. You could not know on what false grounds I had been separated from James." I had started to escape, but stopped just beyond the threshold of the door as she uttered these words. Philemon was not as ignorant as she supposed. This was evident from his attitude and expression. "Agatha," he began, but at this first word, and before he could clasp the hands held helplessly out before her, she gave a great cry, and staggering back, eyed both her father and himself in a frenzy of indignation that was all the more uncontrollable from the superhuman effort which she had hitherto made to suppress it. "You too!" she shrieked. "You too! And I have just sworn to love, honor, and obey you! Love you, honor you, the unconscionable wretch who—" But here Mr. Gilchrist rose, weak, tottering, quivering with something more than anger. He approached his daughter and laid his finger on her lips. "Be quiet," he said. "Philemon is not to blame. A month ago he came to me and prayed that as a relief to his mind I would tell him why you had separated yourself from James. He had always thought the match had fallen through on account of some foolish quarrel or incompatibility, but lately he had feared there was something more than he suspected in this break, something that he should know. So I told him why you had dismissed James, and whether he knew James better than we did, or whether he had seen something in his long acquaintance with these brothers which influenced his judgment, he said at once, 'This cannot be true of James. It is not in his nature to defraud any man.' But John, I might believe it of John. Isn't there some complication here? I had never thought of John, and did not see how John could be mixed up with an affair I had supposed to be a secret between James and myself. But when we came to locate the day, Philemon remembered that on returning to his room that night, he had found John awaiting him. As his room was not 5 doors from that occupied by Mr. Orr, he was convinced that there was more to this matter than I had suspected. But when he laid the matter before James, he did not deny that John was guilty, but was peremptory in wishing you not to be told before your marriage. He knew that you were engaged to a good man, a man that your father approved, a man that could and would make you happy. He did not want to be the means of a second break, and besides, and this, I think, was the bottom of the stand he took, for James Zabel was always the proudest man I ever knew. He never could bear, he said, to give to one like Agatha a name which he knew and she knew was not entirely free from reproach. It would stand in the way of his happiness and ultimately of hers. His brother's dishonor was his. So while he still loved you, his only prayer was that after you were safely married and Philemon was sure of your affection, he should tell you that the man you once regarded so favorably was not unworthy of that regard. To obey him, Philemon has kept silent, while Agatha, what are you doing? Are you mad, my child?" She looked so for the moment, tearing off the ring which she had worn but an hour. She flung it on the floor. Then she threw her arms high up over her head and burst out in an awful voice. "Curses on the father! Curses on the husband who have combined to make me rue the day I was born! The father I cannot disown, but the husband—" "Hush!" It was Mr. Gilchrist who dared her fury. Philemon said nothing. "Hush! He may be the father of your children. Don't curse." But she only towered the higher, and her beauty, from being simply majestic, became appalling. "Children!" she cried. "If ever I bear children to this man, may the blight of heaven strike them as it has struck me this day. May they die as my hopes have died, or if they live, may they bruise his heart as mine is bruised, and curse their father as—" Here I fled the house. I was shaking as if this awful denunciation had fallen on my own head. But before the door closed behind me, a different cry called me back. Mr. Gilchrist was lying lifeless on the floor, and Philemon, the patient, tender Philemon, had taken Agatha to his breast and was soothing her there as if the words she had showered upon him had been blessings instead of the most fearful curses which had ever left the lips of a mortal woman. The next letter was in Agatha's handwriting. It was dated some months later, and was stained and crumpled more than any other in the whole packet. Could Philemon once have told why? Were these blotted lines the result of his tears falling fast upon them, tears of 40 years ago, when he and she were young and love had been doubtful? Was the sheet so yellowed and so seamed because it had been worn on his breast and folded and unfolded so often? Philemon, thou art in thy grave, sleeping sweetly at last by the deeply idolized one. But these marks of feeling still remain indissolubly connected with the words that gave them birth. End of Part 2 of Why Agatha Webb Will Never Be Forgotten in Sutherlandtown. Recorded by Gabby Cowan. Section 35 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Part 3 of Why Agatha Webb Will Never Be Forgotten in Sutherlandtown. Dear Philemon, you are gone for a day and a night only, but it seems a lengthened absence to me, meriting a little letter. You have been so good to me, Philemon, ever since that dreadful hour following our marriage, that sometimes I hardly dare yet to say always. I feel that I am beginning to love you, and that God did not deal with me so harshly when he cast me into your arms. Yesterday I tried to tell you this when you almost kissed me at parting, but I was afraid it was a momentary sentimentality, and so kept still. But today such a warm well-spring of joy rises in my heart when I think that tomorrow the house will be bright again, and that in place of the empty wall opposite me at table, I shall see your kindly and forbearing face. I know that the heart I had thought impregnable has begun to yield, and that daily gentleness and a boundless consideration from one who had excuse for bitter thoughts and recrimination are doing what all of us thought impossible a few short months ago. Oh, I am so happy, Philemon, so happy to love where it is now my duty to love. And if it were not for that dreadful memory of a father dying with harsh words in his ears, and the knowledge that you, my husband, yet not my husband, are bearing ever about with you echoes of words that in another nature would have turned tenderness into gall, I could be merry also, and sing as I go about the house, making it pleasant and comfortable against your speedy return. As it is, I can but lay my hand softly on my heart as its beatings grow too impetuous, and say, God bless my absent Philemon, and help him forgive me. I forgive him, and love him as I never thought I could. That you may see that these are not the weak outpourings of a lonely woman, I will here write that I heard today that John and James Zabel have gone into partnership in the shipbuilding business, John's uncle having left him a legacy of several $1,000s. I hope they will do well. James, they say, is full of business and is, to all appearance, perfectly cheerful. This relieves me from too much worry in his regard. God certainly knew what kind of a husband I needed. May you find yourself equally blessed in your wife. Another letter to Philemon a year later. Dear Philemon, hasten home, Philemon. I do not like these absences. I am just now too weak and fearful, since we knew the great hope before us. I have looked often in your face for a sign that you remembered what this hope cannot but recall to my shuddering memory. Philemon, Philemon, was I mad? When I think what I said in my rage, and then feel the little life stirring about my heart, I wonder that God did not strike me dead rather than bestow upon me the greatest blessing that can come to a woman. Philemon, Philemon, if anything should happen to the child, I think of it by day, I think of it by night. I know you think of it too, though you show me such a cheerful countenance and make such great plans for the future. Will God remember my words, or will he forget? It seems as if my reason hung upon this question. A note this time in answer to one from John Zabel. Dear John, thank you for your words, which could have come from nobody else. My child is dead. Could I expect anything different? If I did, God has rebuked me. Philemon thinks only of me. We understand each other so perfectly now that our greatest suffering comes in seeing each other's pain. My load I can bear, but his, come and see me, John, and tell James our house is open to him. We have all done wrong, and are caught in one net of misfortune. Let it make us friends again. Below this, in Philemon's hand. My wife is superstitious. Strong and capable as she is, she has regarded this sudden taking off of our firstborn as a sign that certain words uttered by her on her marriage day, unhappily known to you, and, as I take it, to James also, have been remembered by the righteous God above us. This is a weakness which I cannot combat. Can you, who alone of all the world beside know both it and its cause, help me by a renewed friendship, whose cheerful and natural character may gradually make her forget? If so, come like old neighbors, and dine with us on our wedding day. If God sees that we have buried the past and are ready to forgive each other the faults of our youth, perhaps he will further spare this good woman. I think she will be able to bear it. She has great strength, except where a little child is concerned. that alone can henceforth stir the deepest recesses of her heart. After this a gap of years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children were laid away to rest in Portchester churchyard. Then Philemon and she came to Sutherlandtown, but not till after a certain event had occurred, best made known by this last letter to Philemon. Dearest husband, our babe is born, our sixth and our dearest, and the reproach of its first look had to be met by me alone. Oh, why did I leave you and come to this great Boston, where I have no friend but Mrs. Sutherland? Did I think I could break the spell of fate or Providence by giving birth to my last darling among strangers? I shall have to do something more than that if I could save this child to our old age. It is borne in upon me like fate that never will a child prosper at my breast or survive the clasp of my arms. If it is to live, it must be reared by others. Some woman, who has not brought down the curse of heaven upon her by her own blasphemies, must nourish the tender frame and receive the blessings of its growing love. Neither I nor you can hope to see recognition in our babe's eye. Before it can turn upon us with love, it will close in its last sleep, and we will be left desolate. What shall we do, then, with this little son? To whose guardianship can we entrust it? Do you know a man good enough or a woman sufficiently tender? I do not. But if God wills that our little Fredrick should live, He will raise up someone. By the pang of possible separation already tearing my heart, I believe that He will raise up someone. Meanwhile, I do not dare to kiss the child, lest I should blight it. He is so sturdy, Philemon, so different from all the other 5. I open this to add that Mrs. Sutherland has just been in with her 5 weeks old infant. His father is away too, and has not yet seen his boy, and this is their first after 10 years of marriage. Oh, that my future opened before me as brightly as hers. The next letter opens with a cry. Philemon, come to me, Philemon. I have done what I threatened. I have made a sacrifice. Our child is no longer ours, and now perhaps he may live. But oh, my breaking heart, my empty arms, help me to bear my desolation, for it is for life. We will never have another child. And where is it? Ah, that is the wonder of it, near you, Philemon, yet not too near. Mrs. Sutherland has it, and you may have seen its little face through the car window if you were in the station last night when the express passed through to Sutherlandtown. Ah, but she has her burden to bear too, an awful secret burden like my own, only she will have the child for. Philemon, she has taken it in lieu of her own, which died last night in my sight, and Mr. Sutherland doesn't know what she has done, and never will, if you keep the secret, as I shall, for the sake of the life of our little innocent, has thus won. What do I mean, and how was it all? Philemon, it was God's work, all but the deception, and that is for the good of all, and to save 4 broken hearts. Listen, yesterday, only yesterday, it seems a month ago, Mrs. Sutherland came again to see me with her baby in her arms. Mr. Sutherland is expected home, as you know, this week, and she was about to start out for Sutherlandtown, so as to be in her own house when he came. The baby was looking well, and she was the happiest of women, for the one wish of his heart and hers had been fulfilled, and she was soon going to have the bliss of showing the child to his father. My own babe was on the bed asleep, and I, who am feeling wonderfully strong, was sitting up in a little chair as far away from him as possible. Not out of hatred or indifference, oh no, but because he seemed to rest better when left entirely by himself, and not under the hungry look of my eye. Mrs. Sutherland went over to look at it. "Oh, he is fair like my baby," she said, "and almost as sturdy, though mine is a month older," and she stooped down and kissed him. Philemon, he smiled for her, though he never had for me. I saw it with a greedy longing that almost made me cry out. Then I turned to her and we talked. Of what? I cannot remember now. At home we had never been intimate friends. She is from Sutherlandtown and I am from Portchester, and the distance of 9 miles is enough to estrange people. But here, each with a husband absent and a darling infant lying asleep under our eyes, interests we have never thought identical drew us to one another, and we chatted with ever increasing pleasure, when suddenly Mrs. Sutherland jumped out in a terrible fright. The infant she had been rocking on her breast was blue. The next minute it shuddered. The next it lay in her arms dead. I heard the shriek, yet, with which she fell with it still in her arms to the floor. Fortunately no other ears were open to her cry. I alone saw her misery. I alone heard her tale. The child had been poisoned. Philemon, poisoned by her! She had mistaken a cup of medicine for a cup of water, and had given the child a few drops in a spoon just before setting out from her hotel. She had not known at the time what she had done, but now she remembered that the fatal cup was just like the other, and that the two stood very near together. Oh, her innocent child! And oh, her husband! It seemed as if the latter thought would drive her wild. He has so wished for a child, she moaned. We have been married 10 years, and this baby seemed to have been sent from heaven. He will curse me. He will hate me. He will never be able after this to bear me in his sight. This was not true of Mr. Sutherland, but it was useless to argue with her. Instead of attempting it, I took another way to stop her ravings. Lifting the child out of her hands, I first listened at its heart, and then, finding it was really dead— Philemon, I have seen too many lifeless children not to know. I began slowly to undress it. "What are you doing?" she cried. Mrs. Webb, what are you doing?" For reply I pointed to the bed, where 2 little arms could be seen feebly fluttering. "You shall have my child," I whispered. "I have carried too many babies to the tomb to dare risk bringing up another," and catching her poor wandering spirit with my eye, I held her while I told her my story. "Philemon, I saved that woman." Before I had finished speaking, I saw the reason return to her eye, and the dawning of a pitiful hope in her passion-drawn face. She looked at the child in my arms, and then she looked at the one in the bed, and the long-drawn sigh with which she finally bent down and wept over our darling told me that my cause was won. The rest was easy. When the clothes of the 2 children had been exchanged, she took our baby in her arms and prepared to leave. Then I stopped her. Swear, I cried, holding her by the arm and lifting my other hand to heaven. Swear you will be a mother to this child. Swear you will love it as your own and rear it in the paths of truth and righteousness. The compulsive clasp with which she drew the baby to her breast assured me more than her shuddering. I swear that her heart had already opened to it. I dropped her arm and covered my face with my hands. I could not see my darling go. It was worse than death. For the moment it was worse than death. Oh God, save him, I groaned. God make him an honor. But here she caught me by the arm. Her clutch was frenzied. Her teeth were chattering. Swear in your turn, she gasped. Swear that if I do a mother's duties by this boy, you will keep my secret and never, never reveal to my husband, to the boy, or to the world that you have any claims upon him. It was like tearing the heart from my breast with my own hand, but I swore. Philemon, and she in her turn drew back. But suddenly she faced me again, terror and doubt in all her looks. Your husband, she whispered. Can you keep such a secret from him? You will breathe it in your dreams. I shall tell him, I answered. Tell him. The hair seemed to rise on her forehead, and she shook so that I feared she would drop the babe. Be careful, I cried. See, you frighten the babe. My husband has but one heart with me. What I do, he will subscribe to. Do not fear, Philemon. So I promised, in your name. Gradually she grew calmer. When I saw she was steady again, I motioned her to go. Even my more than mortal strength was failing. And the baby, Philemon, I have never kissed it, and I did not kiss it then. I heard her feet draw slowly towards the door. I heard her hand fall on the knob, heard it turn, utter one cry, and then they found me an hour after, lying along the floor, clasping the dead infant in my arms. I was in a swoon, and they all think I fell with the child, as perhaps I did, and that its little life went out during my insensibility. Of its features, like and yet unlike our boys, no one seems to take heed. The nurse who cared for it is gone, and who else could know that little face but me? They are very good to me, and are full of self-reproaches for leaving me so long in my part of the building alone. But though they watch me now, I have contrived to write this letter, which you will get with one, telling of the baby's death, and my own dangerous condition. Destroy it, Philemon, and then come. Nothing in all the world will give me comfort but your hand laid under my head and your true eyes looking into mine. Ah, we must love each other now, and live humbly. All our woe has come from my early girlish delight in gay and elegant things. From this day on, I eschew all vanities, and find in your affection alone the solace which heaven will not deny to our bewildered hearts. Perhaps in this way the blessing that has been denied us will be visited on our child, who will live, I am now sure, to be the delight of our hearts and the pride of our eyes, even though we are denied the bliss of his presence and affection. Mrs. Sutherland was not seen to enter or go out of my rooms. Being on her way to the depot, she kept on her way, and must be now in her own home. Her secret is safe, but ours, oh, you will help me to preserve it. Help me not to betray. Tell them I have lost 5 babies before this one. Delirious. There may be an inquest. She must not be mentioned. Let all the blame fall on me, if there is blame. I fell. There is a bruise on the baby's forehead, and I am growing incoherent. I will try and direct this, and then love, oh God. A scroll for the name. Under it these words: though bidden to destroy this, I have never dared to do so. Some day it may be of inestimable value to us or our boy. Philemon Webb. This was the last letter found in the first packet. As it was laid down, sobs were heard all over the room, and Fredrick, who for some time now had been sitting with his head in his hands, ventured to look up and say, "Do you wonder that I endeavored to keep this secret, bought at such a price and sealed by the death of her I thought my mother, and of her who really was? Gentlemen, Mr. Sutherland loved his wife and honored her memory. To tell him, as I shall have to within the hour, that the child she placed in his arms 25 years ago was an alien, and that all his love, his care, his disappointment, and his sufferings had been lavished on the son of a neighbor, required greater courage than to face doubt on the faces of my fellow townsmen, or anything in short but absolute arraignment on the charge of murder. Hence my silence, hence my indecision, till this woman," here he pointed a scornful finger at Amabel, now shrinking in her chair, "drove me to it by secretly threatening me with a testimony which would have made the murderer of my mother and the lasting disgrace of a good man who alone has been without blame from the beginning to the end of this desperate affair. She was about to speak when I forestalled her. My punishment, if I deserve such, will be to sit and hear in your presence the reading of the letters still remaining in the coroner's hands." These letters were certain ones written by Agatha to her unacknowledged son. They had never been sent. The first one dated from his earliest infancy, and its simple and touching hopefulness sent a thrill through every heart. It read as follows: 3 years old, my darling, and the health flush has not faded from your cheek, nor the bright gold from your hair. Oh, how I bless Mrs. Sutherland that she did not rebuke me when your father and I came to Sutherlandtown and set up our home where I could at least see your merry form toddling through the streets, holding on to the hand of her who now claims your love. My darling, my pride, my angel, so near and yet so far removed. Will you ever know, even in the heaven to which we all look for joy after our weary pilgrimage is over, how often in this troubled world, and in these days of your early infancy, I have crept out of my warm bed, dressed myself, and without a word to your father, whose heart it would break, gone out and climbed the steep hillside just to look at the window of your room, to see if it were light or dark, and you awake or sleeping, to breathe the scent of the eglantine which climbs up to your nursery window. I have braved the night damps and the watching eyes of heaven. But you have a child's blissful ignorance of all this. You only grow and live, my darling, live, which is the only boon I crave, the only recompense I ask. Have I but added another sin to my account, and brought a worse vengeance on myself than that of seeing you die in your early infancy? Fredrick, my son, I heard you swear today, not lightly, thoughtlessly, as boys sometimes will in imitation of their elders, but bitterly, revengefully, as if the seeds of evil passions were already pushing to life in the boyish breast. I thought so innocent. Did you wonder at the strange woman who stopped you? Did you realize that awful woo from which my commonplace words sprang? No, no, what grown mind could take that in, least of all a child's? To have forsworn the bliss of motherhood and entered upon a life of deception for this! Truly heaven is implacable, and my last sin is to be punished more inexorably than my first. There are worse evils than death. This I have always heard, but now I know it. God was merciful when he slew my babies, and I, presumptuous in my rebellion, and the efforts with which I tried to prevent his work. Fredrick, you are weak, dissipated, and without conscience. The darling babe, the beautiful child, has grown into a reckless youth, whose impulses Mr. Sutherland will find it hard to restrain, and over whom his mother too, I call her your mother, has little influence, though she tries hard to do a mother's part and save herself and myself from boundless regret. My boy, do you feel the lack of your own mother's vigor? Might you have lived under my care and owned a better restraint, and learned to work and live a respectable life in circumstances less provocative of self-indulgence? Such questions, when they rise, are maddening. When I see them form themselves in Philemon's eyes, I drive them out with all the force of my influence, which is still strong over him. But when they make way in my own breast, I can find no relief, not even in prayer. Fredrick, were I to tell you the truth about your parentage, would the shock of such an unexpected revelation make a man of you? I have been tempted to make the trial at times. Deep down in my heart I have thought that perhaps I should best serve the good man who is growing grey under your waywardness, by opening up before you the past and present agonies of which you are the unconscious centre. But I cannot do this while she lives. The look she gave me one day when I approached you a step too near at the church door proves that it would be the killing of her to reveal her long preserved secret now. I must wait her death, which seems near, and then no, I cannot do it. Mr. Sutherland has but one staff to lean on, and that is you. It may be a poor one, a breaking one, but it is still a staff. I dare not take it away. I dare not. Ah, if Philemon was the man he was once, he might counsel me, but he is only a child now, just as if God had heard my cry for children and had given me him. More money, and still more money, and I hate it except for what it will do for the poor and incapable about me. How strange are the ways of Providence to us who have no need of aught beyond a competence. Money pours in almost against our will, while to those who long and labor for it, it comes not, or comes so slowly. The life wears out in the waiting and the working. The Zabels now, once well-to-do shipbuilders, with a good business and a home full of curious works of art, they now appear to find it hard to obtain even the necessities of life. Such are the freaks of fortune, or should I say the dealings of an inscrutable providence. Once I tried to give something out of my abundance to these old friends, but their pride stood in the way and the attempt failed. Worse than that, as if to show that benefits should proceed from them to me rather than from me to them, James bestowed on me a gift. It is a strange one, nothing more nor less than a quaint Florentine dagger, which I had often admired for its exquisite workmanship. Was it the last treasure he possessed? I am almost afraid so. At all events, it shall lie here in my table drawer, where I alone can see it. Such sights are not good for Philemon. He must have cheerful objects before him, happy faces such as mine tries to be. But I would gladly give my life if I could once hold you in my arms, my erring but beloved son. Will the day ever come when I can? Will you have strength enough to hear my story and preserve your peace and let me go down to the grave with the memory of one look, one smile that is for me alone? Sometimes I foresee this hour, and I am happy for a few short minutes, and then some fresh story of your recklessness is wafted through the town, and what stopped her at this point we shall never know. Some want of Philemon's, perhaps. At all events, she left off here, and the letter was never resumed. It was the last secret outpouring of her heart. With this broken sentence, Agatha's letters terminated. That afternoon, before the inquiry broke up, the jury brought in their verdict. It was death by means of a wound inflicted upon herself in a moment of terror and misapprehension. It was all his fellow townsmen could do for Fredrick. End of Part 3 of Why Agatha Webb Will Never Be Forgotten in Sutherlandtown. Recorded by Gabby Cowan. Section 36 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Chapter 33. Father and Son. But Frederick's day of trial was not yet over. There was a closed door to open and a father to see, as in his heart he still called Mr. Sutherland. Then there were friends to face, and foes, under conditions he better than anyone else knew were in some regards made worse rather than better by the admissions and revelations of this eventful day. Agnes, for instance. How could he meet her pure gaze? But it was his father he must first confront, his father to whom he would have to repeat in private the tale which robbed the best of men of a past, and took from him a son, almost a wife, without leaving him one memory calculated to console him. Frederick was so absorbed in this anticipation that he scarcely noticed the 2 or 3 timid hands stretched out in encouragement toward him, and was moving slowly toward the door, behind which his father had disappeared so many hours before, when he was recalled to the interest of the moment by a single word, uttered not very far from him. It was simply, "Well?" but it was uttered by Knapp and repeated by Mr. Courtney. Frederick shuddered, and was hurrying on when he found himself stopped by a piteous figure that, with appealing eyes and timid gestures, stepped up before him. It was Amabel. "Forgive," she murmured, looking like a pleading saint. "I did not know. I never dreamed. You were so much of a man, Frederick, that you bore such a heart, cherished such griefs, were so worthy of love and a woman's admiration. If I had Her expression was eloquent, more eloquent than he had ever seen it, for it had real feeling in it. But he put her coldly by. When my father's white hairs become black again, and the story of my shame is forgotten in this never forgetting world, then come back and I will forgive you. And he was passing on when another touch detained him. He turned, this time in some impatience, only to meet the frank eyes of Sweetwater. As he knew very little of this young man, save that he was the amateur detective who had by some folly of his own been carried off on the Hesper, and who was probably the only man saved from its wreck, he was about to greet him with some commonplace phrase of congratulation, when Sweetwater interrupted him with the following words: "I only wanted to say that it may be easier for you to approach your father with the revelations you are about to make if you knew that in his present frame of mind he is much more likely to be relieved by such proofs of innocence as you can give him than overwhelmed by such as show the lack of kinship between you. For 2 weeks Mr. Sutherland has been bending under the belief of your personal criminality in this matter. This was his secret, which was shared by me." "By you?" "Yes, by me. I am more closely linked to this affair than you can readily imagine. Some day I may be able to explain myself, but not now. Only remember what I have said about your father. Pardon me. I should perhaps say Mr. Sutherland, and act accordingly. Perhaps it was to tell you this that I was forced back here against my will by the strangest series of events that ever happened to a man. But," he added, with a sidelong look at the group of men still hovering about the coroner's table, "I had rather think it was for some more important office still. But this the future will show, the future which I seem to see lowering in the faces over there." And, waiting for no reply, he melted into the crowd. Fredrick passed at once to his father. No one interrupted them during this solemn interview, but the large crowd that in the halls and on the steps of the building awaited Frederick's reappearance showed that the public interest was still warm in a matter affecting so deeply the heart and interests of their best citizen. When, therefore, that long closed door finally opened, and Fredrick was seen escorting Mr. Sutherland on his arm, the tide of feeling which had not yet subsided since Agatha's letters were read vented itself in one great sob of relief, for Mr. Sutherland's face was calmer than when they had last seen it, and his step more assured, and he leaned, or made himself lean, on Frederick's arm, as if to impress upon all who saw them that the ties of years cannot be shaken off so easily, and that he still looked upon Fredrick as his son. But he was not contented with this dumb show, eloquent as it was. As the crowd parted, and these two imposing figures took their way down the steps to the carriage which had been sent for them, Mr. Sutherland cast one deep and long glance about him, on faces he knew and on faces he did not know, on those who were near and on those who were far, and raising his voice, which did not tremble as much as might have been expected, said deliberately: "My son accompanies me to his home. If he should afterwards be wanted, he will be found at his own fireside. Good day, my friends. I thank you for the goodwill you have this day shown us both." Then he entered the carriage. The solemn way in which Fredrick bared his head in acknowledgment of this public recognition of the hold he still retained on this one faithful heart, struck awe into the hearts of all who saw it, so that the carriage rolled off in silence, closing one of the most thrilling and impressive scenes ever witnessed in that time-worn village. End of chapter 36. Father and Son. Recorded by Gabby Cowan.
Section 37 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Agatha Webb by Anna Katharine Green. Not when they are young girls. But alas, all tides have their ebb as well as flow, and before Mr. Sutherland and Fredrick were well out of the main street, the latter became aware that notwithstanding the respect with which his explanations had been received by the jury, there were many of his fellow townsmen who were ready to show dissatisfaction at his being allowed to return in freedom to that home where he had still every prospect of being called the young master. Doubt, that seed of ramifying growth, had been planted in more than one breast, and while it failed as yet to break out into any open manifestation, there were evidences enough in the very restraint visible in such groups of people as they passed that suspicion had not been suppressed or his innocence established by the over-favorable verdict of the coroner's jury. To Mr. Sutherland, suffering now from the reaction following all great efforts, much, if not all, of this quiet but significant display of public feeling passed unnoticed. But to Fredrick, alive to the least look, the least sign that his story had not been accepted unquestioned, this passage through the town was the occasion of the most poignant suffering. For not only did these marks of public suspicion bespeak possible arraignment in the future, but through them it became evident that even if he escaped open condemnation in the courts, he could never hope for complete reinstatement before the world, nor, what was to him a still deeper source of despair, anticipate a day when Agnes's love should make amends to him for the grief and errors of his more than wayward youth. He could never marry so pure a being while the shadow of crime separated him from the mass of human beings. Her belief in his innocence and the exact truth of his story, and he was confident she did not believe him, could make no difference in this conclusion. While he was regarded openly or in dark corners, or beside the humblest fireside, as a possible criminal, neither Mr. Sutherland, nor her father, nor his own heart even, would allow him to offer her anything but a friend's gratitude, or win from her anything but a neighbor's sympathy. Yet in bidding good-bye to larger hopes and more importunate desires, he parted with the better part of his heart and the only solace remaining in this world for the boundless griefs and tragic experiences of his still young life. He had learned to love through suffering, only to realize that the very nature of his suffering forbade him to indulge in love. And this seemed a final judgment, even in this hour of public justification. He had told his story and had been for the moment believed. But what was there in his life? What was there in the facts as witnessed by others? What was there in his mother's letters, and the revelation of their secret relationship, to corroborate his assertions, or to prove that her hand and not his had held the weapon when the lifeblood gushed from her devoted breast? Nothing. Nothing. Only his word to stand against all human probabilities and natural interference, Only his word and the generous nature of the great-hearted woman who had thus perished. Though a dozen of his fellow citizens had by their verdict professed their belief in his word and given him the benefit of a doubt involving his life as well as his honor, he, as well as they, knew that neither the police nor the general public were given to sentimentality, and that the question of his guilt still lay open and must remain so till his dying day. For from the nature of things no proof of the truth was probable. Batsy being dead, only God and his own heart could know that the facts of that awful half-hour were as he had told them. Had God in his justice removed in this striking way his only witness, as a punishment for his sins and his mad indulgence in acts so little short of crime as to partake of its guilt and merit its obloquy? He was asking himself this question as he bent to fasten the gate. His father had passed in, the carriage had driven off, and the road was almost solitary, but not quite. As he leaned his arm over the gate and turned to take a final glance down the hillside, he saw, with what feelings no one will ever know, the light figure of Agnes advancing on the arm of her father. He would have drawn back, but a better impulse intervened, and he stood his ground. Mr. Halliday, who walked very close to Agnes, cast her an admonitory glance which Fredrick was not slow in interpreting, then stopped reluctantly, perhaps because he saw her father, perhaps because he knew that an interview between these two were unavoidable and had best be quickly over. Fredrick found his voice first. "Agnes," said he, "I am glad of this opportunity for expressing my gratitude. You have acted like a friend, and have earned my eternal consideration, even if we never speak again." There was a momentary silence. Her head, which had drooped under his greeting, rose again. Her eyes, humid with feeling, sought his face. "Why do you speak like that?" said she. "Why shouldn't we meet? Does not everyone recognize your innocence? And will not the whole world soon see, as I have, that you have left the old life behind, and have only to be your new self to win everyone's regard?" "Agnes," returned Frederick, smiling sadly as he observed the sudden alarm visible in her father's face at these enthusiastic words, "you know me perhaps better than others do, and are prepared to believe my words and my more than unhappy story. But there are few like you in the world. People in general will not acquit me, and if there was only one person who doubted—" Mr. Halliday began to look relieved. "I would fail to give any promise of the new life you hope to see me lead, if I allowed the shadow under which I undoubtedly rest to fall in the remotest way across yours. You and I have been friends and will continue such, but we will hold little intercourse in future, hard as I find it to say so. Does not Mr. Halliday consider this right? As your father he must." Agnes's eyes, leaving Frederick's for a moment, sought her father's. Alas! There was no mistaking their language. Sighing deeply, she again hung her head. "Too much care for people's opinion," she muttered, "and too little for what is best and noblest in us. I do not recognize the necessity of a farewell between us any more than I recognize that any one who saw and heard you today can believe in your guilt. But there are so many who did not hear and see me. Besides," here he turned a little and pointed to the garden in his rear, "for the past week a man, I need not state who, nor under what authority he acts, has been hiding under that arbor, watching my every movement, and almost counting my sighs. Yesterday he left for a short space, but today he is back. What does that argue, dear friend? Innocence completely recognized does not call for such guardianship. The slight frame of the young girl bending so innocently toward him shuddered involuntarily at this, and her eyes, frightened and flashing, swept over the arbor before returning to his face. If there is a watcher there, and if such a fact proves you to be in danger of arrest for a crime you never committed, then it behooves your friends to show where they stand in this matter, and by lending their sympathy, give you courage and power to meet the trials before you. Not when they are young girls, murmured Fredrick, and casting a glance at Mr. Halliday, he stepped softly back. Agnes flushed and yielded to her father's gentle pressure. "Good-bye, my friend," she said, the quiver in her tones sinking deep into Frederick's heart. "Some day it will be good morrow," and her head turned back over her shoulder took on a beautiful radiance that fixed itself forever in the hungry heart of him who watched it disappear. When she was quite gone, a man, not the one whom Frederick had described as lying in hiding in the arbor, but a different one, in fact, no other than our old friend the constable, advanced around the corner of the house and presented a paper to him. It was the warrant for his arrest on a charge of murder. End of section 37. Recording by Sharon Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Section 38 of Agatha Webb. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wooly B. Agatha Webb by Anna Katharine Green. Sweetwater pays his debt at last to Mr. Sutherland. Fredrick's arrest had been conducted so quietly that no hint of the matter reached the village before the next morning. Then the whole town broke into uproar, and business was not only suspended, but the streets and docks overflowed with gesticulating men and excited women, carrying on in every corner and across innumerable doorsteps the endless debate which such an action on the part of the police necessarily opened. But the most agitated face, though the stillest tongue, was not to be seen in town that morning, but in a little cottage on an arid hill slope overlooking the sea. Here Sweetwater sat and communed with his great monitor, the ocean, and only from his flashing eye and the firm set of his lips could the mother of Sweetwater see that the crisis of her son's life was rapidly approaching, and that on the outcome of this long brooding rested not only his own self-satisfaction, but the interests of a man most dear to them. Suddenly, from that far horizon upon which Sweetwater's eye rested with a look that was almost a demand, came an answer that flushed him with a hope as great as it was unexpected. Bounding to his feet, he confronted his mother with eager eyes and outstretched hand. "Give me money, all the money we have in the house. I have an idea that may be worth all I can ever make or can ever hope to have. If it succeeds, we can save Frederick Sutherland. If it fails, I have only to meet another one of Knapp's scornful looks. But it won't fail. The inspiration came from the sea, and the sea, you know, is my second mother." What this inspiration was he did not say, but it carried him presently into town and landed him in the telegraph office. The scene later in the day, when Fredrick entered the village under the guardianship of the police, was indescribable. Mr. Sutherland had insisted upon accompanying him, and when the well-loved figure and white head were recognized, the throng, which had rapidly collected in the thoroughfare leading to the depot, succumbed to the feelings occasioned by this devotion, and fell into a wondering silence. Fredrick had never looked better. There is something in the extremity of fate which brings out a man's best characteristics, and this man, having much that was good in him, showed it at the moment as never before in his short but over-eventful life. As the carriage stopped before the courthouse on its way to the train, a glimpse was given of his handsome head to those who had followed him closest, and as there became visible for the first time in his face, so altered under his troubles, a likeness to their beautiful and commanding Agatha, a murmur broke out around him that was half a wail and half a groan, which affected him so that he turned from his father, whose hand he was secretly holding, and, taking the whole scene in with one flash of his eye, was about to speak, when a sudden hubbub broke out in the direction of the telegraph office, and a man was seen rushing down the street holding a paper high over his head. It was Sweetwater. "News!" he cried. "News! A cablegram from the Azores! A Swedish sailor!" But here a man with more authority than the amateur detective pushed his way to the carriage and took off his hat to Mr. Sutherland. "I beg your pardon," said he, "but the prisoner will not leave town today. Important evidence has just reached us." Mr. Sutherland saw that it was in Fredrick's favor and fainted on his son's neck. As the people beheld his head fall forward and observed with a look which Fredrick received him in his arms, they broke into a great shout. "News! News!" they shrieked. "News! Fredrick Sutherland is innocent! See, the old man has fainted from joy!" And the caps went up and the tears fell before a mother's son of them knew what grounds he had for his enthusiasm. Later, they found they were good and substantial ones. Sweetwater had remembered the group of sailors who had passed by the corner of Agatha's house just as Batsy fell forward on the window-sill, and, cabling to the captain of the vessel at the first port at which they were likely to put in, was fortunate enough to receive in reply a communication from one of the men, remembered the words she shouted. They were in Swedish, and none of his mates had understood them, but he recalled them well. They were: "Hjälp! Hjälp! Frun håller på att döda sig, hon har en kniv! Hjälp! Hjälp!" In English: "Help! Help! My mistress kills herself! She has a knife! Help! Help!" The impossible had occurred. Batsy was not dead, or at least her testimony still remained, and had come at Sweetwater's beck from the other side of the sea to save her mistress's son. Sweetwater was a made man, and Fredrick? In a week he was the idol of the town. In a year? But let Agnes's contented face and happy smile show what he was then. Sweet Agnes, who first despised, then encouraged, then loved him, and who, next to Agatha, commanded the open worship of his heart. Agatha is first, must be first, as anyone can see who beholds him, on a certain anniversary of each year, bury his face in the long grass which ever yielded to the pressure of life's deepest tragedy. The End. End of section 38. Recording by Willie B. End of Agatha Webb by Anna Katharine Green.